The lights at the press conference were cold. They were a sterile, blinding white, like the hallways of a hospital. I stood behind the podium, but I didn't wear a suit. I just had on a deep gray jacket, unzipped, over a matching sweater. The cuffs were frayed, two loose threads hanging from my wrist like broken pieces of rope. I didn't look at the crowd. The screen behind me flickered to life. It showed the back wall of the orphanage. Dead grass grew from the cracks in the bricks. The iron gate was crooked, its latch rusted a deep, angry red. The camera shook for a second, then steadied on Lu Fun. He wasn't wearing a scarf. The scars on his neck from last winter's frostbite hadn't healed yet. They weren't even scabbed over. He wore that same old padded coat, missing a button, held together by a mess of black thread. He didn't look at the lens. He looked at the ground beneath his feet, cracked concrete, dry dirt, and a scrap of a plastic bag fluttering in the wind. "When I was 7, he said, his voice steady. "I was locked underground for 3 days. He paused. He didn't cry. He didn't tremble. His right thumb just mindlessly rubbed the inside of his left wrist, right over an old scar left by a heavy chain. Nobody came to save me. He finally looked up, staring straight into the camera. His eyes were gray, like clouds after a heavy snow. Later, I found out the truth. I was never Lu Fun. The room went silent. I could hear people catching their breath. Somewhere in the back, someone dropped their coffee. "I am the stolen Lin Yuan," he continued, not waiting for a reaction. "But today, I choose to be Lu Fun. Not because of my blood, but because that is the name I learned to love." His mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. It was just a sharp muscle spasm, like a curtain caught in a sudden draft. Then, the screen went black. 3 seconds later, the internet exploded. It wasn't the usual flood of insults or memes. The comments were quiet. Row after row of text filled the screen like rain hitting a window. People started sharing their own stories. They talked about being the replacement child, about being told they were picked up from the trash, about finally having the courage to ask who they really were. I didn't move. I looked down at my phone. A message from Lu Fun was glowing on the screen. "Don't cry." I didn't reply. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, the zipper catching halfway. I turned and walked toward the backstage. Someone stood up in the audience, their voice shaking, asking if I was the real Lin Yuan. I didn't answer. I didn't look back. Nobody tried to stop me. The press conference ended faster than anyone expected. There were no follow-up questions, no reporters chasing me to my car. They just stood there, watching the replay, watching the words "the name I learned to love" scroll across the screen again and again. I walked out of the building. The wind whipped around the street corner, smelling of gasoline and the sweetness of roasted sweet potatoes. I wasn't wearing gloves. My fingers were stiff and frozen, but I didn't hide them in my pockets. I stopped at a convenience store across the street and bought a bottle of water. I didn't open it. I just held it until a thin layer of frost formed on the plastic, melting under my thumb. I didn't go back to the hotel. I went to the orphanage. Lu Fun was there, sitting under that same brick wall. He was leaning back, an old waterproof photo album spread across his knees. The edges were curled and worn. It was full of our lives, him at 7, me at 10, a nurse holding a crying baby, the stairs of the old Lu house, the iron door of the basement, and a heavy copper key. He wasn't looking at the photos. He was staring at a tiny sprout of green grass pushing through a crack in the wall. It was small, just 2 leaves, with a single drop of dew hanging from the tip. I walked over and squatted down beside him. I placed the water bottle at his feet. "You cried," he said, without looking up. "I didn't," I replied. "Your eyes are red." "It's just the wind." Lu Fun finally looked at me. He studied my face for 3 long seconds, then reached into the album and pulled out a single photograph. It was taken in Switzerland. My mother was holding me, and a nurse was holding him. In the background, sunlight streamed through a hospital window, hitting our ankles. We both had a tiny mole in the exact same spot. "When I was little," Lu Fun said softly, "I always thought this was just a birthmark." I didn't say anything. I took the photo and flipped it over. On the back, in my mother's fading handwriting, were a few small words. "Yuan, you survived. He lived for you. Don't hate him, *." I handed the photo back. "What you said today, was it the truth?" "Yes." Not just to win the lawsuit. No. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a thin envelope. It looked just like the one that had come from Switzerland all those years ago. I held it out. He didn't take it. What is it? He asked. Something your mother left for you. She isn't my. She is your mother, I interrupted. Do you remember the song she sang to you? Twinkle, twinkle, little star. When you were 7, she crawled into that basement in the middle of the night to sing it to you. You don't remember the words, but I've heard you hum the tune. Lufin froze. He looked down at his hands. His palms were scarred, and there was dirt under his fingernails. Finally, he reached out and took the envelope. He didn't open it. He just tucked it into his coat pocket, right against his chest. The wind blew again, kicking up dust around our feet. I stood up and brushed the dirt off my pants. The sky was pale, the moon not yet visible. Let's go, I said. Where? Back to the hotel. I changed my mind about staying away. Lufin didn't move. He kept his eyes on that tiny sprout of grass. The dewdrop fell, and the leaves trembled but didn't break. I waited 5 seconds. I didn't rush him. Then, I leaned down, picked up a piece of broken brick, and gently wedged it near the base of the plant. There, I said. Now it might live a little longer. Lufin looked at the brick. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old copper key. It was warm from his body heat, the metal polished bright from years of handling. He placed the key right next to the sprout, tucked under the edge of the brick. Now, he whispered, maybe he can live a little longer too. I looked at him, but I didn't smile. I just turned and started walking. Lufin stayed behind for a moment, staring at the key and the grass. 10 minutes later, he finally stood up, wiped his pants, and followed me. I was waiting for him by the convenience store. The frost on my water bottle had turned into droplets that rolled down and dripped onto my shoes. When he caught up, we didn't speak. The yellow glow of the street lamp fell between us like a border. I handed him the water. He took it, but he didn't drink. He just watched the ripples in the bottle until they went still. Tomorrow, he said, looking at the faint moon. Let's go to Iceland. I nodded. Okay. We turned toward the subway entrance, our footsteps crunching on the gravel. Behind us, hidden under a heavy brick, a tiny green sprout swayed in the wind. It didn't fall. We held the art exhibition in the northernmost part of a small town in Iceland. It was inside an old warehouse with bare concrete walls. The roof leaked, and plastic sheets were nailed over the gaps, flapping against the frame like someone knocking on glass. I didn't hire a PR team. I didn't send out invitations. I just taped a single piece of paper to the door. The handwriting was messy, and the edges were stained. It said, "Asterisk, if you have ever been treated as a replacement, stand here. Look at these paintings, asterisk." There were 30 paintings in total. No labels. No names. They were arranged in a line that stretched to the back of the warehouse. The first few were dark, featuring skies that looked like burnt paper and a small child who looked like a speck of dust. Then came the snowfields. The frozen lakes. 2 shadows walking side by side. One taller, one shorter, both wearing old coats without scarves. On the 3rd afternoon, the snow stopped. A beam of sunlight cut through the warehouse, landing perfectly on the final painting. It showed 2 children, their hands locked together, standing in the light. I stood in front of a wooden door. The paint had mostly peeled away, revealing the pale, grayish grain of the wood underneath. A sliver of light leaked through the crack, not a warm gold, but a sterile, stark white. It looked like the light from an open refrigerator that someone had forgotten to close. An old woman stood there. She had been standing still for nearly 20 minutes. She wore a deep blue wool coat with a shiny, worn-out collar and sleeves that were patched with clumsy, crooked stitches. In her hand, she clutched a cloth bag. The seams were fraying, showing a ball of gray yarn stained with a few specks of dried blood. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stared at that door. "This is my son," she whispered. Her voice was as light as falling snow. His name was Lufin. Before anyone could react, she turned and walked away. She didn't look back, and she didn't leave a name. The door remained ajar. A gust of wind swirled in from outside, making the ceremonial paper on the floor tremble. I watched her from behind. I didn't chase her, and I didn't call out. I simply wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck. The silver ring on my left ring finger caught the light for a split second. Not a glow, just a cold reflection. I walked over and stood on my tiptoes to take down the painting. The frame was heavy. There was a crack in the corner from when I had been moving things last winter. I never fixed it. I moved the painting to the deepest corner of the warehouse, the spot furthest from the door. The wall next to it was empty now. It used to hold a painting of the northern lights, but that was gone. I pulled a pencil from my bag. The tip was blunt from being sharpened too many times. Slowly, my hand trembling slightly from exhaustion rather than cold, I wrote a single line on the wall. Dedicated to all those who were forgotten, yet still chose to shine. I put the pencil back in my pocket. The zipper was stuck, leaving my gray sweater exposed. 2 loose threads hung from my cuff, like broken pieces of rope. I didn't look at the art. I went to the back to organize the frames. A few rusty, dusty nails were scattered on the floor. I knelt down and picked them up one by one, placing them in a tin box. I left the lid slightly cracked. Outside, the snow began to fall again. It was fine and dense, like salt tossed into the wind. Lufin arrived at dusk. He didn't enter the exhibition. He stood at the door, staring at the sign I had posted for 3 minutes. The wind whipped the edges of the paper, but he didn't budge. He didn't even take off his gloves. He wore an old padded jacket with a missing button, replaced by a messy knot of black thread. The scar on his neck was still there, unhealed, untreated. He looked down at his shoes. The mud had dried into hard clumps, looking like frozen earth. He stood there for 10 minutes, then turned and walked away. He left 2 rows of footprints in the snow, deep, shallow, crooked, and straight, like 2 broken lines trying to connect. Inside, I didn't turn on the lights. It was almost dark. Beams of light poked through the gaps in the plastic roofing, highlighting the paintings on the walls. I sat on the floor with my back against the concrete, clutching half a piece of bread. I didn't need it. The crust had gone hard and crumbs spilled onto my pants, but I didn't move. A moment later, I heard the door creak. The wind had pushed it open. Lufin was standing there. He didn't come in. He was holding a paper bag with 2 cups of hot coffee inside, condensation beating on the lids. He set the bag on the floor without a word. I didn't look up. "You didn't go in," I said. He grunted. "Why?" "I was afraid she'd see me." "Who?" "The woman in the blue coat." I didn't reply. I put the bread back in my pocket and wiped the crumbs off my leg. Lufin took a step forward, his muddy boots leaving a gray streak on the concrete. "That painting," he said, pausing. "You drew it." "No," I said. "You did." "When you were 7, in the basement." Lufin stood perfectly still. "You remember?" "I remember," I said. "You drew it 37 times. The door was different every time. Sometimes it was red, sometimes black. Sometimes it was just light." Lufin looked down at his own hands. On the inside of his left wrist, that old scar was still there. It had faded, but it would never disappear. He traced it absent-mindedly. "That day," he started, his voice low, "I drew that door on the basement wall. It took so long. When I finished, I fell asleep." "I know," I said. "How do you know?" "Because that night, I went through the cardboard box under your bed. You had hidden 32 drawings. You never signed them, but you wrote the date on the back of every single one." Lufin didn't say anything. He drifted down to sit across from me, the 2 coffees sitting between us. Water droplets fell from the cups, one by one, hitting the floor in silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because you said it yourself," I replied. "You didn't want to be Jiangjin anymore. But now," I interrupted, "I don't want you to feel like I'm just helping you find a way back home." Lufin stared at me, unblinking. The wind rattled the plastic sheets again. I stood up and brushed the dust off my pants. I picked up the coffees, handed one to him, and kept the other. I didn't drink it. I walked to the corner, to that final painting, and ran my knuckles along the cracked frame. "If you want to go in," I said, "you can do it now." Lufin didn't move. He just looked at the words I had written, dedicated to all those who were forgotten, yet still chose to shine. He didn't speak. He turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. The warehouse went quiet, save for the flapping plastic. I stood there staring at my coffee. It was still steaming, but no longer hot. I didn't drink a drop. I placed the cup on a wooden table in the back. A table marked with a scratch from last winter that I had never bothered to sand down. I turned off the lights. The warehouse was pitch black, except for that one painting. Light from the doorway hit the painted door. That sliver of light in the art hadn't changed. It was still cold, white, like a refrigerator light left on in the dark. I locked the door. The copper key felt cold in my pocket. As I walked away, the snow continued to fall, slowly covering the 2 sets of footprints until the ground was smooth again. The warehouse door wasn't shut tight. A gust of wind nudged it open just a crack, leaving the painting to hang in the silence, its light still shining through the dark. The courtroom was freezing. They had the air conditioning cranked up too high. Snowflakes still clung to the hem of Lu Fun's coat. He didn't sit down. He stood at the witness stand, the copper key pressed so hard into his palm it left a mark. When the judge spoke, Lu Fun didn't look up. He just stared at the scar on his left hand. When he was 7, wood splinters had been buried under his fingernails. Dust from the peeling walls had mixed with his blood to form black scabs that hadn't fully faded in 20 years. "Do you admit," the lawyer asked, "that you are not of the Lu family bloodline?" He didn't answer. He just raised his left hand, palm up. The scar sat right in the middle of his palm, like a broken lifeline. "I am not Lu Fun," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but every reporter in the front row stopped writing. Someone nudged a recording pin forward, the metal clicking against the table. I was sitting in the back of the gallery. My jacket was half unzipped, and the loose threads on my sweater swayed slightly. I didn't look at Lu Fun. I didn't look at the lawyer. I just stared at a small puddle on the floor. Someone had stepped in slush before coming in, and the muddy print was already drying, cracking into tiny lines. "Do you admit," the judge asked, "that you were swapped at birth?" Lu Fun didn't flinch. He put the copper key into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he spoke. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I am the one who learned how to call for mama while trapped in the dark." No one spoke. Someone in the gallery coughed and quickly muffled it. A man in a suit in the front row flipped through a file, the sound of paper like a soft intrusion. I finally moved. I didn't stand up, but I reached out and rested my left hand on Lu Fun's right. I didn't grip it. I just let our hands touch, like 2 dry leaves blown together by the wind. Lu Fun didn't pull away. He didn't look at me, but his breathing finally slowed down. The lawyer frowned and turned back to the judge. The lawyer didn't back down. He claimed I was manipulating public emotion and using a fake identity to gain sympathy. He called my actions a desecration of the judicial process and demanded the Life Seed Act be revoked. He even wanted the witnesses prosecuted for perjury. The judge didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the case files in his hands. The edges were curled and stained with watermarks, as if someone had gripped and rubbed them 1,000 times. He looked up, and the courtroom went silent. His gaze lingered for a second on an old woman with white hair in the gallery. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just stared at Lu Fun's back, the loose threads on her cloth bag fraying a little more. "Have you ever checked the door lock on the Lu family's old basement?" Lu Fun suddenly asked. The lawyer blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "That door," Lu Fun continued. "It's an old-fashioned lock with a copper core. There are only 3 keys. One is with my father. One is in the drawer of my mother's bedside table. The third one is in the safe at the nurse's station." He paused. His voice remained flat. "You never checked because you thought a child who was swapped at birth couldn't possibly know these things." The lawyer opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The judge leaned forward. "How do you know the third key is at the nurse's station?" "When I was 7, Lu Fun said, I peeked at the nurse's duty schedule. He went to collect medicine every afternoon at 3. The key hung from his belt, tied with a red string. He stopped there. No one asked for more. No one dared. My hand was still resting against his, unmoving. I looked down at the ring on my finger. 2 small characters were engraved inside the band, worn down until they were almost invisible. I didn't wipe them or try to hide them. The lawyer took a half step back and turned to the judge. "We have a witness. We can prove that before Lu Fun released the video, he met with Jiang Jin privately multiple times. There is suspicion of conspiracy." "Which witness?" the judge asked. "The former housekeeper of the Lu family, Chen Deshan." As soon as the name was spoken, The back door of the courtroom creaked open. A man in a worn gray coat stood there. He was carrying a plastic bag containing 2 bottles of water, one unopened, the other half empty. He didn't walk to the front. He just stood by the door, looking at Lu Fun. "Chin Deshan," the judge called out. The man didn't answer. He set the plastic bag on the floor, reached into the bottom, and pulled out a piece of paper. He handed it to the bailiff. It was a photocopy, wrinkled and stained with dust. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Isn't that Lu Fun's birth certificate?" The judge pushed the paper toward the lawyer. "Are you sure this is your witness?" The lawyer looked down, and his face turned pale. It was an obstetrics registration form from the day Lu Fun was born. It listed newborn A as Lu Fun and newborn B as Jiang Jing. In the remarks section, there was a line of small, handwritten text in faded ink. Asterisk, mother sent a back after waking. Be reported by mistake. Asterisk. Below it was a signature. It was blurry, but recognizable as the mother's name. The lawyer's mouth hung open. He had nothing left to say. I finally raised my head. I looked at Lu Fun, then at that piece of paper, and slowly pulled my hand away from his. Lu Fun didn't move. He stood there, his scar pale under the courtroom lights. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, black and white photo with curled edges. It showed a woman holding 2 infants, one in blue and one in red. She wasn't smiling. She was looking into the camera as if saying, "Don't cry." Lu Fun didn't show it to the crowd. He just placed it on the witness stand and weighted it down with the copper key. "What is this?" the judge asked. "My mother," Lu Fun said. "The day she held both of us." He didn't say who was who. No one asked. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Someone coughed. Someone turned a page. Someone set a water cup back on a table, the wood letting out a soft thud. Chin Deshan didn't leave immediately. He stood at the door, his lips moving as if he wanted to say something. In the end, he just picked up his plastic bag and walked out. He left the door open. A draft blew in from the hallway, swirling a scrap of paper across the floor until it stuck to the tip of Lu Fun's shoe. I stood up. I didn't speak or look at anyone. I walked to Lu Fun's side, picked up the photo, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my inner pocket. I moved gently, afraid of creasing it further. The judge banged his gavel. Recess. No one clapped. No one left. The white-haired woman stood up and walked out slowly, pulling the strap of her bag higher. Lu Fun stared at the scrap of paper by his foot. When the wind blew again, it stayed stuck to the floor. "Let's go," I whispered, standing behind him. Lu Fun gave a soft grunt of agreement. We walked out together. We didn't hold hands or walk shoulder to shoulder. We kept a half-step of distance between us, just like we used to in the backyard of the orphanage. When one walked faster, the other would slow down to match. At the end of the hallway, a window was open. The wind rattled a dead potted plant on the sill. The leaves were yellow, but the roots were still buried deep in the soil. I stopped to close the window. Lu Fun didn't look back. We walked out, and the door clicked shut behind us. The hallway lights flickered on, one by one, stretching into the distance. Down by the stairs, a janitor pushed a bucket, leaving a trail of water on the floor that led all the way outside. It had started to snow again. I thought back to when Lu Fun first broke into the basement of the old Lu house. The lock had been rusted shut. He hadn't used a professional tool. He'd used a screwdriver from the kitchen, one with a bent tip and a handle stained with cooking oil. He had knelt at the basement door, his knees pressing into a deep red rug. The house was empty then. The servants were gone, and even the old gatekeeper had passed away the winter before, leaving a warning not to touch that place. The air from the doorway had smelled of dampness and rotting wood, mixed with the scent of old sweaters that had been dried in the sun and forgotten in a closet. He had jammed the screwdriver in. There was a metallic click, not a break, but a release. He pulled with everything he had, the veins on his hand bulging. The door groaned open like a heavy cough. Inside, the light flickered yellow, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The walls weren't just painted. They were covered in wallpaper that was peeling and wrinkled from water damage. And on that wallpaper, there were drawings. Crayon drawings. They were messy, childlike scribbles in red and blue. Every single drawing featured the same silhouette, a thin, small figure in an old coat with short hair and narrow shoulders. They were packed together, row after row, like a silent crowd. Lufun had crouched down and touched the corner of one drawing. There was a date written in pencil. March 14th, 1998. Age 3. Below that, July 22nd, 1999. Age 4.5. The dates continued all the way to August 17th, 2007. Age 12. The very last drawing was of a wooden door with peeling paint. Light was leaking through the cracks, drawn with thick, heavy strokes of white crayon, as if trying to block something out. Or maybe, to keep something in. In the corner of that basement sat an old tape recorder with a cracked plastic shell. It was still plugged in. It was playing. A woman's voice came through the speakers, soft and hushed, as if she were afraid of waking someone. "Jean, the voice said. Today, Papa took you swimming again. You have such a beautiful smile. But you don't know? Your brother was in the water, too. But he couldn't swim," the voice on the tape continued. "I was so afraid he would drown. So, I pulled him out." The recording stopped. There was no cassette inside, no buttons to press. The voice just looped, frozen in a single, haunting moment. I didn't move. Slowly, I let my knees drop to the floor. The cold concrete bit through my pants, but I didn't care. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just pressed my face against the floor, my forehead resting on the freezing ground. My eyes were closed, my eyelashes trembling. I listened to my own breathing. It was soft, like a draft leaking through a door. The recorder clicked on again. "Jean, you drew your heart out today, didn't you? You drew a door. There was light inside. Mama knows. You." It cut off again. I didn't look up. My right hand was still white-knuckled around the screwdriver. I opened my left hand and pressed my palm flat against the floor. There was a scar there. I got it when I was 7. It ran right through the middle of my palm like an unfinished line. I didn't make a sound, but the tears started falling. One drop hit the concrete. Silent. A second drop followed, then a third. They soaked into the dust like ink and water. I didn't wipe them away. The machine spoke again. "Your brother, he doesn't talk. But he remembers. He remembers you're afraid of the dark. He remembers you need your blanket at midnight. He remembers how you hide candy under your pillow. He doesn't blame me. He just doesn't talk." My shoulders shook. I stayed down, pressing my face harder against the floor. A breeze drifted in through the basement window. The glass was cracked, held together by yellowed tape that was peeling at the corners like a dead leaf. On the windowsill sat an old tin biscuit box. The lid was loose, revealing a broken red crayon. It looked like it had been bitten. Inside the box were a few pieces of paper, folded neatly. I didn't touch them, but I saw them. One was a hospital birth registry from March 14th, 1998. 2 names were listed. One was blacked out. The other was Jean. The other paper was a note written in pencil. The handwriting was small and crooked, like a child's. Mama didn't choose one over the other. I just didn't want either of you to grow up without being able to call for her. I didn't pick it up. I didn't move. "Jean, tomorrow Mama will take you to the sea," the voice promised. "Do you remember? You said the sea is blue, just like the sky you drew." The sound died. I slowly raised my head. My face was stained with tears, but I didn't wipe them. I stood up, my legs numb and shaky. I grabbed the wall for support. The drawings of that same silhouette stared back at me, one after another. I walked to the recorder and touched the switch. It wasn't off. I walked to the window and tried to close the cracked glass. The tape was stuck firm. I used the back of the screwdriver to press the peeling edges back down. I turned and walked to the door. I didn't close it. I let the wind keep blowing, swirling dust over the crayon drawings, the tin box, and the speaker of the recorder. I walked out and pulled the main door shut behind me. I didn't lock it. I didn't have a key. The hallway light flickered yellow, then stayed on. I walked downstairs quietly, as if I were afraid of waking someone up. In the living room, a glass of water sat on the coffee table. It was half finished, a single tea leaf resting at the bottom. On the rim, there was a faint lip mark from my mother. It had been there for 20 years. I didn't touch it. I went to the entryway and changed my shoes. They were old, the soles cracked, and caked with dried snow. I pulled open the front door. The wind rushed in, shaking the hem of my coat. It was snowing. The air felt like gray ash. I stood on the steps. Behind me, the basement door was still ajar. The wind carried the scent of crayons and old, moldy sweaters. I looked at the sky. A snowflake landed on my eyelash and didn't melt. I waited a few seconds, then turned toward the mouth of the alley. My steps were slow. Behind me, the door remained open. The wind kept blowing. The letter from Iceland arrived at 3 in the afternoon. The postmark said Reykjavik. There was no stamp, just tape sealing the edges. When Jiang opened it, the adhesive stuck to his fingernails. The paper was old printer stock, yellowed at the edges. The handwriting looked like it had been washed several times. He read it 3 times before putting it down. He went to the kitchen. The faucet was leaking. Drip, drip. The water splashed into the stainless steel sink, tiny droplets bouncing like grains of salt. He tucked the letter into his inner coat pocket and left. He didn't take an umbrella. The wind was vicious, knocking a fleck of rust off the doorframe onto his sleeve. Lufin was in Iceland. Jiang had checked the flights and took the first one available. He didn't tell anyone. He couldn't sleep on the plane. A child next to him was crying, and the mother was humming softly, as if trying not to wake the world. Jiang stared at the clouds. Below them, the light was a grayish-white. The church was on the outskirts of Reykjavik. The bell tower was short, moss growing in the cracks of the stone bricks. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, 12 metal plates, each engraved with words. As he approached, the chimes were silent. The wind had stopped. Lufin stood beneath them. He didn't look up. His hands were buried in his coat pockets. His collar turned up to reveal an old sweater. Jiang recognized it. His mother had knitted it. The cuffs were frayed, and Lufin had never fixed them. "You came," Lufin said. Jiang didn't answer. He held out the letter. Lufin didn't take it. He just stared at the chimes. "Your mother," Jiang started. "She didn't send you away. She sent the other one back." Lufin didn't move. He reached out, his fingertip touching the bottom metal plate. It was engraved with the name Jiang. The metal was cold, free of rust, and polished clean. "She didn't choose," Lufin said. "She saved you both," Jiang replied. "She didn't save anyone." Lufin shook his head. "She just didn't let anyone die." The wind picked up. One metal plate clinked against another. A short, sharp sound, like a heartbeat skipping. Jiang pulled the birth registry from his pocket. The paper was thin and worn, the ink faded, but the names were clear. Lufin looked at it, but didn't reach for it. "When did you know?" Jiang asked. "Last winter," Lufin said. "Before Zhao left, he gave me a note. He said your mother gave him the key before she passed. She told him if I ever asked, to tell me the answer was in the wind chimes." Jiang went quiet. He looked at his shoes. The soles were cracked. "The basement," Jiang said suddenly. "Did you always know the drawings on the wall weren't just yours?" Lufin didn't answer. He looked at the top of the bell tower. A crow sat on the cross, silent and still. Every night, Lufin said, your mother would go to that room. She wouldn't speak. She would just stand there and look at the drawings. Sometimes she stayed all night. "You saw her?" "I heard her," Lufin said. "When she cried, she didn't make a sound. Her shoulders just shook." Jiang's throat tightened. "When you were 7, you screamed for your brother to save you. Did she teach you to say that?" Lufin turned to look at him. His eyes weren't red, but they were gray and exhausted. "I didn't scream," Lufin said. "Then why?" "He stood outside my door," Lufin interrupted. "Over and over, he told me. Asterisk call for Jiner. Call for your brother to save you. Asterisk. I didn't know how. So he kept saying it. He didn't stop until my voice went hoarse. The chimes rang again. 2 plates collided. Asterisk clink. Clink. Asterisk. Jiang reached into his pocket and felt the copper key. He didn't hand it over. He just gripped it until his knuckles turned white. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. Lufin didn't look at the key. He reached up and unhooked a metal plate from the chime. It was the one engraved with the name Lufin. He rubbed his thumb over the letters as if feeling an old scar. "Do you remember when you were 3? Lufin asked. "You had a fever. You cried in the middle of the night." He held you by the window and sang Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Jiangjin nodded. He sang The Stars Are Bright. Both of them were bright, Lufin said softly. Do you remember? Jiangjin shook his head. You were 5, Lufin continued. He knitted you a red scarf. You thought it was ugly and threw it away. He picked it up, unraveled it, and started over. He knitted it into 2. 1 for you, Lufin said softly. 1 for me. I didn't move. I couldn't. Do you remember when you were 10? Lufin continued, his voice steady but hollow. He took you to the beach. You stepped on a shell and cut your foot. He carried you all the way home. He didn't say a word the whole time. The next day, he ground that shell into a tiny bell and hung it over your bed. Lufin paused, looking at the chimes. He never told me, but he hung one over my bed, too. I finally looked up at him. My vision was blurry, my heart heavy with a truth I wasn't ready for. Your mother, Lufin said, his voice trailing off. He never chose one of us over the other. He just didn't want either of us to lose the right to be loved. The wind chimes rang again. 3 plates this time. Asterisk clink. 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 Asterisk. I didn't say anything. I slipped the copper key back into my pocket and turned toward the church door. It wasn't locked. With a heavy groan, it swung open. I didn't look back, and Lufin didn't move. He just stood there, watching the metal plate engraved with my name sway in the wind. After a moment, Lufin pulled a piece of paper from his inner pocket. It was new, written in pencil with a touch so light it was as if the writer was afraid to leave a mark. Jin, he read aloud. If you're reading this, it means you were too afraid to ask. I just didn't want either of you to live in hate. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it behind the chime plate bearing his own name. Then, he turned and walked toward me. I was standing at the bottom of the steps. I hadn't gone far, but I wasn't waiting for him either. I just stared at the mud on my shoes, noticing a new crack in the leather. Lufin stood beside me. We stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder. The wind blew from behind the church, carrying the scent of sea salt and rust. A crow flew off the bell tower. I pulled a pack of cigarettes from my pocket. I didn't light one. I just crushed the pack in my hand. Did you see him? Lufin asked. No, I said. It's just, better not to dwell on it. Want to smoke one now? I shook my head. Your mother used to say cigarettes are bitter, Lufin murmured. But when you're alive, you have to taste some bitterness. I didn't answer. I looked up at the bell tower. Another crow had landed on the cross. The wind chimes sang again. 1, 2, 3 times. Asterisk clink. 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 Asterisk. I reached out and placed a handful of sour plum candies into Lufin's palm. They were cold, but carried the warmth of my body. Lufin didn't grip them. He just let them rest there. We stood like that for 10 minutes. Neither of us moved. In the distance, the church bell tolled. 1, 2, 3. The sound faded, the wind died down, and the chimes went silent. I turned and walked toward the car. Lufin stayed behind for a second, watching a faint glint of sunlight catch the metal, a pale light, like a faded thread from an old sweater. He pulled a maternity registration form from his pocket and slowly tore it in half. He tucked one piece under the wind chime and shoved the other into his own pocket. Then, he followed me down the steps. The snow began to fall. The first flake landed on his shoulder. The second hit the back of my neck. The third landed on the car door handle. It didn't melt. The doctor's office was on the 6th floor of an old building in the west end of the city. The elevator was broken. Signage on the walls warned people to be quiet, the corners of the paper curling with age. Tucked under one sign was a child's drawing. 2 stick figures, one red and one blue, holding hands. Lufin didn't knock. He just pushed the door open. I was standing by the window, clutching a printed sheet of paper so hard the edges were fraying. A cup of cold tea sat on the windowsill. Goji berries settled at the bottom under a thin film of oil. The doctor sat behind his desk. He didn't stand up. He wore a gray sweater with a frayed collar, and half the nail on his left ring finger was missing, as if it had been crushed in a door. An old computer sat on his desk, its screen black, keyboard covered in dust, except for the space bar, which was polished clean from repeated use. "You're here," he said. Lufin didn't speak. He sat on the edge of a cracked leather sofa, his knees propped against the frame. I placed the paper on the coffee table. I didn't push it toward him, but I didn't take it back either. The document was titled, Lu Fun's Psychological Intervention Records, 1998 to 2005. It listed dates, methods, and evaluations. Every entry said the same thing: strengthen identity recognition, eliminate primal attachment, rebuild fear threshold, asterisk. The doctor glanced at it. You found it. We didn't find it, I said. You let it out. Not me. The doctor shook his head. The system archived it automatically. The firewall crashed, and the data leaked into the public cache. I deactivated that account years ago. The registrant was you. I countered. ID number, fingerprints, signature. It's all you. The doctor didn't deny it. He looked down at his left hand. A bit of pale, new flesh was growing where the nail was missing. It looked like a wound that refused to heal. Your father found me, he said. 1998, Lu Fun was 3. He brought him here and said the boy was afraid of the dark. He cried at night. He wouldn't sleep. I told him it was normal. He said no. He said, this child shouldn't remember who he is. Lu Fun stared at the floor. The terrazzo tiles had thin cracks. One started under the sofa and curved toward the table leg. You hypnotized him, I said. You made him believe his fear of the dark was because he'd been locked in a basement. It was a lie. It wasn't a lie, the doctor said. He really believed it. I told him to remember, and he did. He remembered a door, light, and the sound of crying. He said he called out for his brother to save him. I told him he was right, and he believed me. Lu Fun moved slightly, but he didn't look up. So, when I was 7, did I really cry out for my brother to save me? The doctor was silent for 3 seconds. He looked at Lu Fun, then looked away. You didn't. Lu Fun didn't respond. It was your mother, the doctor said. She stood outside the door. Through the crack, she taught you, over and over. Asterisk call for Jeaner. Call for your brother to save you. Asterisk. You didn't know how, so she said it for you. She screamed at herself. Asterisk brother, save me. Brother, save me. Asterisk. Lu Fun's right hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist. Why? Because the Lu family wanted you to forget Jiang Jin, the doctor replied. They didn't want you to be the child who slept beside another boy in a basement. Your mother, she knew that if you didn't hate him, you would never leave him. If you didn't hate him, you wouldn't survive. Lu Fun stood up. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at the doctor. He walked toward the door, his footsteps so light they were almost silent. At the threshold, he stopped. Thank you, he said. At least you didn't make me completely forget that I was once a child. He left the door open. A draft blew in from the hallway, carrying dust that settled into the cold tea. The doctor didn't move. I didn't move. I looked down at the paper. In the bottom right corner, there was a water stain shaped like a maple leaf. I didn't wipe it away. Lu Fun stood in the hallway with his back to us. A piece of dark blue fabric peeked out of his coat pocket, an old scrap of cloth with uncut threads. He stood there for a moment, then the door clicked shut. I was alone with the doctor. The only sound was our breathing. The doctor reached for his tea, his hand shaking so much that a drop spilled onto the keyboard, seeping into the crack of the space bar. He didn't clean it. Outside, the sky was heavy with gray clouds. The sound of a child's laughter drifted up from below, followed by the thud of running feet on wooden stairs. A voice called out, Xiao Bao, don't run so fast. The voices faded. The wind caught the corner of the paper on the table, flipping it over. On the back, there was a line of small, handwritten text, traced over in pencil. Subject number 17. Primal emotions successfully severed. Suggest continued observation until age 12. Below the words was a red thumbprint, smeared and messy. I stared at it for 2 seconds. Then I folded the paper and tucked it into my inner pocket. I walked to the sink, picked up the cold tea, and poured it out. The water splashed like rain hitting a tin roof. I didn't wash the cup. When I turned around, the doctor was staring at me. Why don't you ask? The doctor whispered. Don't you want to know if you were really the one who was abused? I didn't stop walking. I already asked, I said. I asked my mother. I had checked my mother's obstetric records. I had tracked down the testimony from the nurses. When my mother finally woke up after 72 hours in a coma following childbirth, I was the one who told her. I told her that both babies being alive was enough. I paused, looking at the doctor. I didn't ask him for the truth because I already knew the answer. And deep down, I knew he didn't have it anyway. The doctor remained silent. I walked toward the door and placed my hand on the handle. Your son, I said, my voice steady. What was his name? The doctor blinked, looking dazed. Lu Fun, he replied. No, I said, cutting him off. Your son's name was Lu Fun. The one you adopted was Lu Fun. But the one you actually fathered, what was his name? The doctor didn't answer. I didn't wait for one. I pulled the door open and stepped out. The door clicked shut behind me. The hallway light flickered for 3 seconds, then died, plunging the space into shadow. Downstairs, the sound of a child's laughter rang out again. It was closer this time, right at the corner of the stairs. A voice called out, Xiao Bao, don't climb the railing. A gust of wind rushed up from the stairwell, fluttering the notices pinned to the wall. A single sheet of paper tore loose and drifted to the floor. It was a missing persons flyer, 3 years old, with curled edges and faded ink. Asterisk Lu Fun. Male. 3 years old. Wearing a blue padded jacket. A mole behind his left ear. If you have clues, please contact, asterisk. The contact information had been torn off. All that remained on the floor was a strip of dried tape covered in dust. Later, I found myself back at my mother's house. I knelt in front of her wardrobe, my knees pressing into a faded blanket. My fingers searched the bottom of the closet until I found it. Her sewing box. It was made of wood, the corners worn white from years of use. The latch had broken long ago, held together now by a single rubber band. I snapped the band and lifted the lid. Inside were a few spools of thread, 2 thimbles, and a pair of small scissors with a stray blue thread still caught in the blades. I took the items out one by one and laid them on the floor. A ball of yarn had unraveled, tangled into a mess like a cat had been playing with it. I noticed a deep scratch on the inside of one thimble. She had made that last winter while mending a scarf. The handle of the scissors was wrapped in yellowed tape that flaked off at the slightest touch. At the very bottom lay a stack of papers. They weren't in envelopes. They were sheets of printer paper cut down to the size of stationery. The edges were uneven, likely trimmed with kitchen scissors. The paper was yellowed and the ink was blurred, as if it had been soaked in water and then dried. My 2 children. There was no formal greeting and no signature. I flipped through them one by one. The dates spanned from 1999 to 2015, written sporadically. Sometimes there was a 6-month gap, sometimes 2 years. The contents were mundane. She wrote that the weather was getting cold and to remember to wear thick socks. She mentioned a new noodle shop downstairs where the pork bone broth smelled better than the old place. She told me my father was being grumpy again and to ignore him. She told me my brother hadn't eaten that day and asked me to check on him. Then I reached the last one. It was dated March 12, 2017, 7 days before my mother died. If you are both reading this letter at the same time, it means you have finally escaped your respective cages. I remember teaching you how to mend things. It wasn't just to fix clothes. It was so you would understand that some cracks aren't meant to be filled. They are where the light gets in. I put the letter back. I didn't move. I just stared at that line for a long time. Outside, the sky was overcast, and no sunlight reached the room. The lights were off. The only thing visible was a sliver of gray light peeking through the wardrobe door, illuminating the corner of the paper. I reached under the stack and pulled out a scrap of fabric. It was off-white cotton, embroidered with 2 vines. They were twisted together so tightly you couldn't tell which was which. The stitching was crooked. In some places, the thread had snapped and been tied back together in clumsy knots. The color had faded into a dull, grayish green, like dried leaves soaked in water. I recognized the needlework. My mother had embroidered something similar on a scarf for me once. I had told her it was ugly and ripped it off. She hadn't said a word, but the next day, she had embroidered another one and hidden it in the back of the closet. I held the cloth in my hand. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. I just held it. Lufin was standing in the doorway. He hadn't knocked. He was wearing that same old windbreaker, the collar turned up and the cuffs fraying, just like that night in Iceland. He held a plastic bag with 2 bottles of water, one unopened, the other half empty with condensation clinging to the rim. He saw me kneeling there. He saw the cloth. He didn't say anything, and I didn't look up. He walked in, his steps light, leaving faint muddy footprints on the floor. He didn't wipe them away. He walked to the sofa and set the water down, one bottle on the left, one on the right, leaving a wide space in the middle. He sat down, but only on the edge, his knees braced against the frame. He looked just like he had in the doctor's office. I held the scrap of fabric out to him. Lufin didn't take it. He looked down at his own hands. There was a bit of dirt under his left ring finger from cleaning out the study yesterday. He tried to rub it off with his thumb, but it wouldn't budge. "How long did she spend embroidering this?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "When I was a kid, I thought someone else had made it." "You never asked?" "I did." I pulled the cloth back and squeezed it in my palm. "She said someone at the orphanage taught her." Lufin didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. He reached into the inner pocket of his windbreaker and pulled something out, placing it on the coffee table. It was a copper button. The edges were polished bright from wear, and the center was engraved with two intertwining vines. It was identical to the pattern on the cloth. "She gave this to me," he said, "for my 7th birthday. She told me my father sent it. I didn't find out until later that she made it herself." I stared at the button. "Before she left," he continued, his voice dropping low, "I took this button off once while doing laundry. The thread snapped and I lost it. I searched for 3 days. I finally found it in the lint filter of the washing machine. I never took that coat off again." I didn't respond. He placed the fabric on the table next to the button. The two items sat side by side, the messy stitches and the engraved metal, like two matching scars. He stood up and walked to the window. An empty glass sat on the sill, a layer of dust at the bottom and a dried water ring staining the glass. He didn't touch it. Then, Lufin turned back to the wardrobe. He reached into the deepest layer and pulled out an old sweater, the cuffs unraveling. It was the same one from Iceland. He spread the sweater out on the sofa and gripped the loose thread at the cuff. He began to pull, slowly unraveling the sleeve. When the thread snagged, he didn't use scissors. He just tugged at it with his hands, moving gently, as if he were afraid of causing pain. I walked over and stood behind him. He didn't turn around. I reached into my own jacket lining and pulled out the scrap of fabric with the twin vines. Without a word, I laid the cloth over the sweater, covering the hole in the cuff. Lufin's hand stopped. He looked down at the cloth, the crooked stitches, and the faded vines. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The room was so quiet I could hear the wind rattling the metal railing on the balcony. Clang, clang. It was a steady, rhythmic sound. After a long moment, Lufin raised his hand. He didn't touch the cloth on the sweater. Instead, he reached for my sleeve. His fingertips brushed the fabric where I had sewn a similar patch into my own jacket lining. Through the layers, he could feel the slight bump of the stitches. He didn't rub it. He just let his hand rest there, as if confirming something was real. Then, he took a step forward. I didn't move back. Lufin opened his arms and pulled me into a light embrace. He didn't squeeze. He didn't tremble. He didn't cry. He just held me. It felt like that year in the basement, two people breathing on opposite sides of a door, their inhales and exhales slowly falling into sync. The wind whistled through the gap in the window, nudging the water bottles on the table. They rocked, but didn't fall. The copper button and the cloth lay side by side, one cold and bright, the other soft and gray. Lufin rested his chin on my shoulder. His breath was so light it was like he was afraid of disturbing the air. I didn't move. I didn't close my eyes. I looked down and saw a smudge of dust on the toe of my shoe from when I was kneeling at the closet. I didn't wipe it away. A few minutes later, Lufin let go and stepped back. He didn't look at me. He turned back to the sofa and sat down, continuing to unravel the thread. I walked back to the window. I picked up the unopened bottle of water, twisted it open, and took a drink. The water was cold and tasteless. I screwed the cap back on and placed it next to the other bottle. The wind blew in again, catching a corner of the fabric scrap on the table. It flipped over for a split second, revealing the back. There, embroidered in thread so fine it was almost invisible, were two words. Ajin. I didn't look. I turned around and walked toward the door. The handle was loose as I turned it, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The door was stuck. I pushed hard, the metal handle grinding against the frame until it finally gave way. The hallway light was broken, leaving only a single flickering bulb to cast a sickly green glow over the thick layer of dust on the floor. I didn't look back. Inside the room, Lufin didn't look up either. He was still focused on the fabric, his fingers tangled in the loose threads he was trying to unravel. Outside, the clouds cracked open, letting a sliver of sunlight hit the coffee table. It caught the copper button, making it flash, and illuminated the vine pattern on the cloth. Light was finally leaking through the cracks. The auction hall for the Lu family estate was filled with a cold, white glare. The display cases shimmered like a layer of thin ice. Lu Fun had hired 3 small auction houses to handle the event, branding it as the Lu family, conscience and redemption. He sat in the middle of the third row wearing a suit Jiang Jin had picked out for him, deep gray with a matching tie. His left hand rested on his knee while his right stayed in his pocket, clutching that scrap of double vine fabric. The edges of the cloth were frayed now, and the stitching was as crooked as a crawling insect. Jiang Jin didn't show up. The auctioneer stood on stage in a tuxedo, his voice sounding like a low-volume radio broadcast. He announced item number 7, a model successor medal awarded to Lu Fun during his childhood. It was donated by the Lu Foundation, supposedly symbolizing the family's commitment to education and responsibility. The medal was pushed onto the stage, brass base, red ribbon. The front was engraved with the words excellence, loyalty, future. The back featured the Lu family crest, 2 vines entwined around a central ring. A few people in the audience clapped, the sound thin and scattered like rain hitting a tin roof. The bidding started at 100,000. Lu Fin's cousin, Lu Mingyuan, sat in the front row checking his watch, a coffee stain visible on his cuff. He wore an obsidian ring on his ring finger, engraved with the same initials as the ones we found earlier. When the price hit 370,000, an anonymous account suddenly jumped the bid by another 500,000. The room went silent. The auctioneer froze for 2 seconds before confirming the anonymous win. The hammer fell. Lufin didn't move. He just stared as a staff member in white gloves placed the medal into a bulletproof glass box and wheeled it away. The label on the box read, Lu Fun, 1998 model successor, donated by the Lu Foundation. He looked down and pulled his phone from his pocket. A message from a stranger flickered on the screen, 10 p.m. tonight. UN Children's Rights Agency, main hall. Bring the cloth. He shut off the screen and walked out the side door, crossing the parking lot to a black sedan. The window rolled down just an inch. Jiang Jin was in the driver's seat, looking straight ahead. Where did you go? Lufin asked. To sign the authorization forms, Jiang Jin replied. They needed me to confirm the medal was yours before they would take delivery. You didn't tell them it was fake? I did. Jiang Jin paused. They didn't believe me. The car smelled of cigarette smoke and damp clothes. Cardboard boxes were piled in the back seat, sealed with tape but missing labels. One box had a torn corner, revealing a flash of red ribbon. Lufin sat down but didn't put on his seatbelt. He just laid the scrap of fabric gently on his thigh. Where did you send the medal? He asked. To the UN, Jiang Jin said. They said if it's evidence of human experimentation on children, they have an obligation to make it public. Aren't you afraid they'll destroy it? They won't dare. Jiang Jin finally turned to look at him. Because it's being live-streamed. Lufin didn't respond. He watched a streak of water run down the windshield from a recent rain. A withered leaf was stuck to the glass, its edges curled as if it had been burned. At exactly 10 o'clock, the stream started. The screen showed a white wall in the UN main hall, a long table, and 6 cameras. The medal sat in the center on a glass pedestal next to 3 other items. A diary labeled Lu Fun, subject number 17, a photo of 2 boys standing side by side, one in a school uniform, one in a gray jumpsuit, labeled subject 17 and 18, and a printed document titled Lu Family Gene Screening and Identity Reset Program, 1995 to 2001. The host was a woman in a dark blue suit, her hair pulled back tight. She didn't read from a script. She simply told the camera they had received an anonymous tip claiming these weren't honors, but evidence of crimes. She put on gloves and picked up the medal. The camera zoomed in, magnifying the tiny, hidden engraving until it was unmistakable. Lu Fun, subject number 17. The live chat exploded. People were crying, cursing, and sharing the link. But in the hall, it was silent. The camera panned to the audience. The Liu family lawyers sat in the front row, their faces frozen. In the third row, an old woman in a gray coat sat with her white hair perfectly combed. She clutched a handkerchief embroidered with a fading flower. She didn't cry. She just raised her hand slightly, as if afraid to disturb the air. "That's my son," she whispered. The microphone caught it. The room remained so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Lufin stood outside the glass wall of the studio, watching. He didn't look at the screen. He reached into his coat and pulled out the gray scrap of fabric. It was smaller than the metal, the stitching messy, a stray blue thread hanging from the edge. He placed it near the display. The cloth and the metal sat side by side, like two children finally sitting together. The camera stayed on them for 3 minutes until the host whispered that the stream was over. The screen went black. Lufin turned and walked out into the light rain. His coat was half soaked by the time he reached the street corner. He stood there for a moment, watching the rain turn into puddles. A car pulled up beside him. Jiang Jin looked at him, but said nothing. Lufin got in. The car still smelled of smoke. In the back, that torn box showed the red ribbon again, the exact same color as the ribbon on the metal. Jiang Jin started the engine. The rain got heavier as we drove into a tunnel. The overhead lights flashed across our faces one by one, then faded into darkness. Lufin closed his eyes. There was no radio, only the steady rhythm of the wipers against the glass. At the end of the tunnel, a single street lamp cast a slanted light into a puddle, reflecting two shadows, one driving, one sitting. Neither shadow moved. Neither shadow spoke. Later that night, the rain fell like shattered glass falling from the sky. Jiang Jin stood inside a cramped telephone booth, the wind whistling through the cracks in the glass. Half a bottle of water sat by his feet, the cap loose, leaking a map-like stain onto the concrete. He stared at the receiver, his finger hovering over the dial. He waited 5 seconds, then pressed the numbers. It was a number he had memorized when he was 12 years old. The phone rang 3 times. "Hello," a soft voice answered, sounding like it was rising from underground. Jiang Jin didn't speak. "Is that you, Funner?" The voice asked again, hopeful yet cautious. "You're back? It's raining today. Do you remember?" Jiang Jin looked down at his soaked sleeve, the cold fabric clinging to his skin. "I'm not Lu Fun," he said. The other end went quiet. It wasn't the sound of a hang-up. It was the sound of someone who had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. The voice spoke again. It was softer this time, as if afraid to disturb the silence. "Then, who are you?" I turned around. Through the cracks in the phone booth glass, I looked out into the night. The street lamp 50 meters away was half broken. The working half cast a dim, slanted glow over the falling rain. Standing right under that light was Lu Fun. He didn't have an umbrella. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and water dripped from his chin onto his chest. His deep gray suit jacket was a wrinkled mess at the collar. His sleeves were stained with mud. The tips of his shoes were cracked, revealing the yellowed fabric of his socks underneath. He was actually clutching an umbrella in his hand, but it was closed. The metal ribs were bent, looking like a broken spine. I didn't move. I pressed the receiver back to my ear and spoke so softly, it was like I was talking to myself. "He's the person waiting in the rain for you to come home." I pressed the hang-up button. A sharp click, and then there was nothing but the sound of the rain hitting the booth. I slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle. It was thick with dust. My finger left a streak, and particles floated in the dim yellow light. I pushed the door open. The rain rushed at me instantly. Lufin stayed where he was. I walked toward him, my shoes splashing into puddles. A few drops of water flicked up onto his face. I didn't speak, and neither did he. We stood half a step apart while the rain hammered down on our shoulders, our arms, and that closed umbrella. I reached out and took the umbrella from his hand. It was an old black one. The handle was wrapped in tape that had turned yellow and brittle, the edges curling up. I popped it open. There were 2 small holes in the fabric. Rainwater streamed through them, one drop landing right on Lufin's forehead. He didn't flinch. I tilted the umbrella toward him, and we stood there side by side. We didn't leave. The rain grew louder. In the distance, a car drove past. Its tires hit a deep puddle with a heavy splash, sending water clattering against a nearby metal trash can. I looked down at my left hand. There was still a tiny blue thread stuck under my thumbnail from my mother's sewing box yesterday. I hadn't washed it off. Lufan's right hand hung at his side. His knuckles were white. He was gripping something tightly. I glanced at it, but didn't ask. A piece of grayish-white cloth peeked out of his pocket, the twin vines embroidery. It was soaked through, clinging to his leg, the crooked stitches looking like crawling insects. I looked up at the street lamp. The bulb flickered again, struggling to stay lit. "Did you used to wait for him on this road, when you were a kid?" I asked suddenly. Lufan didn't answer. He just pulled his right hand out of his pocket. Lying in his palm was a key. It was brass, old, and the teeth were worn flat from use. A number was engraved on the handle, 17. I didn't take it. I just shifted the umbrella another half-inch over his head. The wind blew the phone booth door, making it swing and creak like a rusted joint. Inside, the receiver sat crooked on the hook. A single drop of water fell from the top of the mouthpiece, hitting the floor and merging with the puddle by my feet. We didn't move for a long time. Finally, Lufan spoke. His voice was so light it barely carried through the rain. "Why? Why did you dial that number?" I didn't look at him, because I knew he was still waiting. Waiting for who? For someone named Lufan. Lufan fell silent. He looked down at the key in his palm, the metal dull in the rain. I collapsed the umbrella. It closed with a soft click. I tried to hand it back, but he didn't take it. I placed it on the ground instead. The tip pointed down, and water ran off the fabric in a thin line, seeping into the cracks in the concrete. I turned and walked toward the mouth of the alley. I didn't look back. Lufan stayed there, motionless. The rain kept falling. Near the trash can at the end of the alley, a cat huddled inside a cardboard box. Its ears twitched, but it didn't wake up. The street lamp flickered one last time and died completely. There was only darkness, the sound of rain, and the umbrella lying on the ground. A bit of mud stuck to the handle, mixed with a few grayish-white threads from the cloth. The wind blew, and the threads drifted away. My mother's wardrobe always smelled of mothballs and old sweaters. Later, I found Lufan crouching on the floor of the old house, his knees pressed against a faded rug. The rug was curled at the edges, revealing a shallow scratch on the floorboards made by a nail. He pulled out a bundle of fabric hidden at the very bottom. It was blue with white flowers, the seams coming apart. The stitching was crooked, like those crawling insects again. He didn't open it immediately. He patted off the dust first, the particles floating in the sunlight like fine snow. Inside the bundle was a stack of photos. The one on top had been torn in half. One half was him at 7 years old. His collar was flipped up, and he was grinning so hard his teeth showed. He was standing in front of the old locust tree at the school gate, the leaves vibrant and green. The other half was me. I was wearing a gray servant's uniform, the cuffs worn white. I was holding a stack of books, physics and algebra workbooks. My head was down. I wasn't looking at the camera, I was looking at the books. On the back of the photo, my mother's handwriting had faded until it was almost gone. We were supposed to be standing together. Lufan didn't say a word. He took the two halves and laid them side by side on the wooden floor. A crack in the wood ran right between them, like a small, jagged river. He pulled a roll of clear tape from his pocket. His fingers shook slightly. He messed up the alignment twice. On the third try, he got it steady. The edges of the tape stuck up, looking like a poorly sealed envelope. He flipped the photo over. There was a line of text added later in pencil. It had been rubbed nearly flat, but if you looked closely, you could still make it out. "I am alive, but you." He stared at those words for a long time. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just flipped the photo back over and looked at it again. In the photo, my uniform sleeve had a dark stain on it. It looked like ink, but it also looked like blood. He tucked the photo into a promotional brochure for an art gallery and took it there. The exhibition was temporary. It had no name and no invitations. A whiteboard hung by the door with a message written in black marker. Asterisk, this is not a photo. It is the torn fate of 2 children. Asterisk. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blurred as if it had been touched by water. Not many people came that afternoon. A man in a suit, a few people in jeans. An old lady in glasses stood in front of the photo for 10 minutes. She didn't say a word before leaving. A girl in a school uniform crouched down and took a picture with her phone. She posted it online with the caption, "It hurts." No one liked the post. Lufin wasn't there. He was in a coffee shop in the alley behind the gallery. He ordered an Americano, no sugar. The ceramic cup had a small chip on the rim. He traced the chip with his thumb 3 times before he finally took a drink. When he finished, he set the cup down. The water rings soaked into the wood of the table, spreading out like a map. The next morning, before the gallery even opened, the janitor pushed his mop inside. He saw a new photo sitting next to the original one. It was black and white, slightly blurry. The background was the northern lights, green and purple ribbons floating in the sky like grief scattered by the wind. 2 people stood side by side. Their shoulders were touching. They weren't holding hands, and they weren't looking at the camera. It was Lufin and me. Lufin was wearing an old jacket. I wasn't in a uniform. I was wearing a deep blue shirt, buttoned all the way to the top. Behind us was a door, the basement door of the Lu family's old estate. A sliver of light leaked through the crack, yellow as a candle flame. The janitor hesitated. He didn't move the photo, and he didn't wipe it. He looked at it for a moment, then turned to mop somewhere else. The mop left wet streaks on the floor. At the end of those streaks stood a pair of old leather shoes. The tips were cracked, showing the yellowed socks inside. Lufin hadn't gone to the gallery. He was in the kitchen of the old house, cooking a pot of porridge. The pot was enamel, the edges chipped away to reveal the black iron beneath. The flames danced lightly under the stove. Steam rose from the lid in rhythmic puffs, like breathing. When I pushed the door open and walked in, he was stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. The spoon scraped against the bottom with a soft thud. "You placed the photo?" I asked. "Yeah." "Did they see it?" "They saw it." "Did they say anything?" "Nothing." I didn't ask anything else. I just took off my coat. I hung my coat on the nail behind the door. The nail was loose. As soon as the weight hit it, the coat tilted 3 degrees to the right. Lufin didn't fix it. He walked over to the stove and checked the pot. "Did you eat?" he asked. "No," I replied. "I made porridge." "Okay." We stood in front of the stove, neither of us moving. The porridge bubbled in the pot. Bubbles popped, only for new ones to rise in their place. Outside, the wind rattled the window, tugging at the old curtains. There was a patch on the corner of the fabric, the color slightly off, the stitching so dense it looked like a scar on the wind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was folded into a neat, perfect square. I didn't hand it to Lufin. I just placed it on the counter, pressing it down right next to the lid of the porridge pot. Lufin glanced at it, but didn't touch it. It was a printout. The title read, "Legal Prosecution Recommendations Regarding Children Displaced in the Tinder Project." Below that were 7 points, each numbered. The last line suggested establishing an identity recovery fund, with the Lu Foundation providing the initial capital. Lufin didn't say a word. He ladled the porridge into 2 bowls. He pushed one toward me and took the other for himself. There was a small crack on the rim of his bowl. He rubbed his thumb over it 3 times before finally taking a sip. The porridge was scalding. He blew on it twice, then stopped. I drank mine too. We stayed silent. Outside, the sky was just beginning to turn gray. I heard the door open downstairs. It was the old butler. He came every day at 6:30 to clean, but today he was 15 minutes late. He pushed the vacuum cleaner through the living room. The wheels got caught in the carpet seam with a loud thud. He knelt down, poked at it twice, failed to dislodge it, and eventually just walked away. Lufin set down his bowl. A little porridge remained at the bottom. I put mine down too, though I had left even more. We didn't look at each other. Lufin stood up and went to the entryway to grab his coat. Dust clung to the collar. He didn't brush it off. He just put it on. I followed behind him, silent and still. At the door, Lufin stopped. His hand rested on the handle, but he didn't turn it. "Are you going to the hearing tomorrow?" he asked. "I'm not," I said. "If you don't go, who will?" "You will." "If you don't go, I won't be able to explain it clearly," he muttered. "You don't need to explain it clearly," I told him. "They already know." Lufin didn't turn around. His hand stayed on the cold handle, his fingers covering the worn bronze base. He didn't say anything else. He pushed the door open. The wind rushed in, carrying the scent of snow. It wasn't just cold, it smelled clean. I stayed where I was. I watched his shadow, but I didn't follow him out. The door remained slightly ajar. The wind slipped through the crack and flipped the corner of the paper on the stove. The edge curled up as if it wanted to fly away. The bowls were still on the table, the steam long gone. All that remained were white streaks of dried starch, looking like unfinished words. Outside, a crow landed on the old locust tree. It gave a single cry and flew off. The shadow of the branches swayed against the wall 3 times, then stopped. On the floor, a small piece of yesterday's fallen leaf was still wedged in the crack of his old leather shoes. The hearing room in the UN building had no windows. Rows of fluorescent lights hummed on the ceiling, white as a hospital corridor. The air smelled of disinfectant, old carpet, and the salty tang of human sweat. When Lufin walked up to the podium, his shoes were stained with mud from the wet plaza outside. He hadn't changed them. He was wearing the same suit from yesterday. The crease on his sleeve wouldn't smooth out no matter how hard he pressed it. He stood still. He didn't look at the crowd or the words projected on the screen. Special hearing on the Tinder incident. He simply placed a stack of papers on the table. They weren't in a folder. The corners were curled and creased, looking like they had been crumpled and then smoothed out again. He didn't speak. The audience didn't move. Officials in the front row looked down at their documents. Journalists in the back held up voice recorders. A camera lens shifted, trying to focus. Someone coughed. It was a soft, strangled sound. 3 seconds later, he began. "I was locked in a basement when I was 7, he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't shake. It wasn't raspy. It was just a flat report. Not because I was bad, but because I was an obstacle to the child they actually wanted." He paused and looked down at his hands. There was still a bit of ash under his fingernails from burning the will yesterday. He didn't wipe it away. "I was hailed as the successor at 20. Not because I was worthy, but because I was capable of covering up their crimes." He looked up. His gaze swept over the first row, where several men in black suits sat. Their ties were tight. Their gold watches glinted on their wrists. They didn't look at him. They stared at the empty space in front of them. "I am standing here today," he said, "not to accuse anyone." He paused longer this time. Someone turned a page, the sound sharp in the silence. "I am here to tell all the children who were treated as replacements." He didn't finish. In the audience, a woman in a gray trench coat suddenly took off her hat. A scar ran across her forehead, from her hairline to her eyebrow. It looked like a knife wound that had been stitched shut. The scar was pale but clear. She didn't cry. She didn't look at anyone else. She just placed her hat on her lap and gripped it until her knuckles turned white. Nobody spoke. Then, a second person stood up. It was a boy in a school uniform, maybe 16 or 17. His hair was dyed blue, and he had 3 studs in his ear. He stood, took off his cap, and revealed his forehead. The same scar was there. A third person, a middle-aged woman in a nurse's uniform, untied her hair. It fell down, covering half her face, before she slowly brushed it aside. The scar remained. A fourth, a fifth. No one screamed. No one sobbed. They just stood up, one by one, removing their hats to show their scars. It was a silent ritual. Lufin didn't move. He watched them, his eyes dry, his gaze steady. He simply pushed the stack of papers to the side. The pages scattered. The one on top was a photocopy of my ID. The photo had been taken 3 years ago in a hospital hallway. I was standing by a window, holding a cup of water I wasn't drinking. More people stood up. They came from the back rows, from the side doors, from the benches in the hallway. They didn't speak to Lufin or to each other. They just stood and revealed their marks. Some had worn wigs. Some had hidden behind bangs or headscarves. Now, it was all out in the open. Over 300 scars, like silent rivers, flowing down from their foreheads to the floor of the conference room. Lufin didn't say anything else. He turned and walked off the stage. His steps were heavy. The mud from his shoes left a faint print on the carpet, like a dried water drop. He didn't look back. As he reached the door, someone offered him a tissue. He didn't take it. It fell to the floor, and no one picked it up. I was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall. I was wearing an old jacket, unzipped over a white t-shirt. My collar was a bit crooked. I held 2 cups of coffee, one hot, one cold. Steam rose from the hot one, which I hadn't opened yet. Lufin walked over. I handed him the cup. He took it, but didn't drink. He just gripped it in his hand. We didn't look at each other. 2 lights in the hallway were broken, flickering, casting half our faces in light and the other half in shadow. Distant footsteps echoed, getting closer. It was a security guard in uniform, talking into a radio. He didn't stop. He just walked past. I looked down at the tips of my shoes. There was a bit of dust on them from the elevator. I didn't clean it. Just now, I started, my voice low. Lufin didn't respond. I hesitated, then changed the subject. The coffee. I bought it downstairs. He grunted. We kept walking. We had no direction. We just moved. At the end of the hallway, a window was cracked open. The wind whistled through the gap, fluttering the gray curtains. On the windowsill sat a potted plant, its leaves yellow and dry, the soil cracked. I stopped and pulled out a cigarette. I didn't light it. I just rolled it between my fingers. Do you regret it? I asked. Lufin didn't answer. He looked down at the coffee in his hand. There was a tiny lip mark on the rim from where I had taken a sip earlier. He didn't wipe it away. I regret it, I said. I regret not telling you about that photo sooner. I've actually kept it this whole time. Lufin finally looked at me. I didn't meet his eyes. I stared out the window. The wind blew the curtains out like a sail, then let them collapse. What about you? I asked. Lufin placed his coffee on the windowsill. The bottom of the cup hit the wood, leaving a damp, circular mark behind. I regret it, he said. His voice was heavy, anchoring us both to the spot. I regret not going down to that basement to find you when you were 7. I didn't move. The wind forced its way through the cracked window again, fluttering the curtains until they brushed against the dry leaves of the potted plant. The plant shivered. In the distance, a voice called out my name. Mr. Jiang, the meeting is over. You need to come sign the documents. I didn't respond. Lufin didn't move either. We stood there like 2 pillars, weathered and slightly bent by the wind. Steam rose from the coffee in a thick plume, then slowly thinned out. The watermark on the windowsill began to fade as the wood soaked it up. The wind kept blowing. The curtains swayed again. My mind drifted back to that basement. The memory was vivid, sharp as a blade. The walls had just been painted white, the surface still damp and smelling of chemicals. In the corners, you could still see the marks where the scrapers hadn't quite reached. The doorframe was made of old, stubborn wood. I had sanded it 3 times, but the edges were still rough, biting into my skin. When Lufin hung the copper key, the small metal ring clicked against the handle. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the silence. 30 children stood in that room. No one spoke. They all clutched drawings in their hands, the paper wrinkled from sweaty palms. Some had drawn doors with the sun peeking through the cracks. Others drew doors with books hidden behind them. One child had drawn a door with no handle at all, just a single, slanted beam of light cutting across the page. No one asked why we were drawing doors. No one asked why the light had to come through the cracks. I stood by the door with a carving knife in my hand. I wasn't wearing gloves. Wood shavings clung to my clothes like scales. There was a fresh cut on my left middle finger, but I hadn't bandaged it. The blood had already dried into a dark, rust-colored line. I leaned down, pressed the tip of the blade against the frame, and began to carve. I worked slowly, etching words into the wood. When I finished the line, I stepped back. I didn't look at it. I didn't say a word. Lufin finished hanging the key. He stared at the words I had carved for 10 seconds, motionless. Then he turned and walked to the wall. He picked up a drawing from the floor. It showed a small child standing inside a doorway, reaching out as if trying to pull someone in. In the bottom corner, a message was scrawled in messy crayon. Mom says when the door opens, it won't be cold anymore. He taped the drawing back to the wall, all the way to the left. The tape went on crooked, leaving one corner to curl upward. There were no lights on in the room. Sunlight filtered in from the high windows, casting bright spots that danced across the floorboards. Someone coughed. It was a little girl sitting in the corner, only 6 years old. Her hair was cut unevenly, and a small scar peeked out from behind her left ear. She didn't cry. She just hugged her drawing tighter. I walked over to her. I pulled a piece of candy from my pocket and held it out. She didn't take it, but she didn't shake her head either. I simply placed the candy on her knee. The blue wrapper caught the light. She gripped it, slowly crushing it into a ball in her fist. Lufin wasn't looking at them. He walked back to the door and ran his fingers over the frame. The wood was cold. The spot where I had carved was rough under his touch. His hand stopped there. A few minutes passed in silence before a boy walked up to him. The boy shoved a drawing into Lufin's hands. It showed 2 trees with 2 figures standing beneath them, one in a white shirt, one in gray. They weren't holding hands, but they stood close. Behind them was a door with yellow light spilling from the crack. The boy didn't say a word. He just turned and walked away. Lufin looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he taped it to the wall directly opposite the door, aligning it perfectly. As evening approached, the light from the windows grew dim. The children were picked up one by one. Some were led away by grandmothers, others by social workers. Some just put on their backpacks and promised to come back tomorrow. No one said goodbye. Finally, only 2 were left. A 10-year-old boy with a slight limp walked up to Lufin. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a blue button. It was round and polished, glowing faintly in the twilight. "My mom left this," he whispered. "She said when the door opens, I should put it inside." Lufin took the button without asking who his mother was. He walked to the door and tucked the button into the gap between the wood and the floor. The boy nodded and left. The last one was a 7-year-old girl who refused to speak. Her eyes were fixed on the door. I knelt in front of her. "Do you want to go in?" I asked. She shook her head. "Do you want to see the light?" She nodded. I stood up and pushed the door. It wasn't locked. It creaked open just half an inch. A sliver of light spilled out, landing right on her toes. She didn't move, but her eyes sparked. I didn't close the door. I just walked back to Lufin. The room fell silent. We sat side by side on the concrete steps. A chip in the cement dug into my leg. Lufin's shoes were still caked with mud from the plaza outside. My sleeves were covered in wood dust. The wind whistled through the door, blowing a scrap of fabric hanging in the corner. It was a piece of cloth my mother had left behind, featuring a faded pattern of twin vines. The colors were almost gone, and the stitching was crooked. As the wind caught it, the cloth swayed, feeling like a phantom hand brushing against our shoulders. "Do you regret it?" I asked. My voice was barely a whisper. Lufin didn't answer immediately. He watched the light from the door crack. It moved slightly with the wind, crawling inch by inch across the steps until it reached his foot. He shook his head. "I only regret one thing," he said. "I regret not holding your hand sooner." I didn't know how to respond. I looked down and pulled a silver bell from my pocket. It was the last thing my mother gave me. I had never really thought about it, but now I gripped it tight, my thumb tracing a tiny scratch on the surface from a fall I had as a kid. The wind picked up, and the fabric scrap danced violently. Lufin looked at the light. It was still thin and pale, but it seemed brighter than before. Jiangjin put the bell back in his pocket and stood up. He brushed the dust off his pants and looked at me. He walked to the door and pushed it another half-inch. More light flooded the room. He didn't close it. I stood up and followed him, stopping just behind him. I was close enough to smell the scent of his old sweater and the faint aroma of wood shavings. We didn't speak. The sunset warmed the chipped concrete of the steps. A sparrow landed on the doorframe, tilted its head at us, and flew away. The twin vine fabric kept swaying. The wind blew through the house, and one by one, the drawings on the walls were illuminated. No one went to turn off the lights. No one went to shut the door. Later, I found the notebook. It was hidden in a cabinet, wrapped in yellowed oil paper that had grown brittle with age. The edges were curled, looking like they had been soaked in water and dried a dozen times. Lufin knelt by the cabinet, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked it up. He didn't use a knife. He used his fingernails to slowly peel back the paper. Inside was a hardbound ledger. The cover was a deep blue that had faded to gray, with a tear in the corner mended by layers of dusty tape. He flipped it open. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my mother's. The script was tight and hurried. November 3rd, 1992. Rain. The sound of the rain at night is like someone hammering on a tin roof. When he took the child away, he didn't look at me. I heard the lock click. I didn't cry. I knew he wouldn't let me see him a second time. Lufin turned the page. The paper was thin, stained with old moisture marks. They weren't from tears. They were from the dampness of the basement. The ink had bled into the stains, making the words look like they were breathing. He named the infant Jiangjin. He said the name should be clear, like ash. I asked him, "What about my other son?" He told me, "Your son is Lu Fun. He was born to burn away the lies." Lu Fun stopped. His hand hovered over the page, frozen. Outside, a sparrow flapped its wings and landed near the eaves, pecking at dry grass. The wind pushed through the door again, lifting the corner of a drawing on the wall. The child reaching for the door seemed to move. He kept reading. Every night at 11, I sneak down the back stairs. The light in the basement is broken, so I light a candle. The baby bottle is old, the nipple worn shiny. He doesn't cry. He doesn't make a sound. He just opens his eyes and watches me. I'm so afraid he'll recognize me that I always keep my back turned. Today, he grabbed the edge of my shirt. He did it 3 times. I didn't turn around. I could feel Lu Fun's gaze on the diary, his thumb tracing the faded ink. The entry described a mother's secret, the first time her son smiled, a song she hummed to him in the dark, and how she never dared to hum it again for fear of being caught. He flipped to the very last page. The handwriting there was frantic, the ink fading as if the writer had run out of strength. Funner, your name is Lu Fun because you were born to burn away the lies. Jiner, your name is Jiangjin because as long as I am alive, you are the fire growing from the ashes. At the bottom of the page, there were 2 faint circular indentations. They looked like marks left by someone pressing their knuckles into the paper, hard. Lu Fun didn't move. He closed the diary, wrapped it back in the oilcloth, and tucked it away in the cabinet. There was a loose floorboard beneath it, but he didn't bother to fix it. He looked up at the drawing on the wall, the child reaching for the door. A patch of sunlight hit the floor right by his feet, looking like a phantom footprint. He stood up and brushed the dust from his trousers. There was still gray ash on his cuffs from when he burned the will yesterday. He didn't care. Footsteps sounded outside the door. They were light, hesitant, as if the person was afraid of waking something up. Lu Fun didn't turn around. Jiangjin stood in the doorway. His left hand hung at his side while his right held a small silver bell. The bell was old, the bronze tarnished, and the cotton cord had faded to a dusty white. It didn't ring. Jiangjin didn't shake it. He just stared at Lu Fun's back for 10 long seconds. Finally, Jiangjin walked in. He didn't stop until he reached the window. There was an empty glass on the sill, the water long evaporated, leaving a white mineral ring behind. He didn't pick it up. He just ran his knuckle along the rim, wiping away a thin layer of dust. You read it? Jiangjin asked. Lu Fun nodded. Yeah. Jiangjin didn't ask anything else. He looked down at the bell in his hand. The cord was a bit loose, so he began to tighten it, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone tying a shoelace. When I was little, he said softly, I stayed awake at night. I never slept. He walked over to the wall and pressed down on the corner of the drawing. The tape was old and losing its stick, the edges curling back up. He tried to flatten it with his fingernail, but it wouldn't stay. Do you remember what she looked like? He asked. Jiangjin shook his head. I don't. I only remember that her hands were always cold. Lu Fun turned to look at him. Jiangjin kept his eyes on the bell. In the dim light, the metal gave off a dull, rusty reflection. You didn't go to the House of Light today? Lu Fun noted. I did, Jiangjin replied. The kids were drawing doors. One kid drew 2, a black one and a white one. He said there was someone waiting for him behind the white door. And behind the black one, his mother was waiting. Lu Fun remained silent. He reached onto the table and picked up a piece of candy. The blue wrapper was wrinkled, as if it had been squeezed tight in a fist for a long time. He peeled it open and held it out. Jiangjin didn't take it. Keep it, he said. Lu Fun set the candy back on the table. The wrapper unfolded, revealing a strawberry-flavored sweet with a cracked shell, showing the pink and white center. Suddenly, Jiangjin rang the bell. The sound was faint, like a distant wind chime. Outside, 3 sparrows suddenly took flight from the eaves. They didn't chirp, they just beat their wings hard, disappearing over the courtyard wall into the locust tree. The shadows shifted, but no leaves fell. Jiangjin tucked the bell into his pocket, moving gently, as if afraid to wake the air itself. Your birthday, he said suddenly. It's November 3rd. Lu Fun went still. I know. My father changed it. I never told anyone. Jiang Jin looked at his own hand. There was an old scar on his middle finger. He rubbed it with his thumb, but said nothing more. Lu Fen walked to the door and pulled the brass key from the handle. It was covered in green oxidation, with a smudge of white plaster from yesterday's wall painting still stuck to the teeth. He didn't wipe it off. He put the key in his pocket and headed for the stairs. I'm going to buy some candles, he said. What color? Jiang Jin asked. White. Then I'll go with you. They walked down in silence. The third step was loose and groaned under their weight. Lu Fen stepped over it, but Jiang Jin stepped right on it. The wood let out a heavy thud, sounding like a muffled sigh. Outside the gate, the wind swirled dead leaves against the wall. A single footprint remained in the mud from the day before, not yet washed away by the rain. Lu Fen pushed the door open. Sunlight hit the frame, illuminating a row of carved words. There are no heirs here, only people returning home. Jiang Jin followed him out. The door stayed open. The wind blew in, catching a piece of fabric decorated with twin vines hanging behind the door. It swayed gently, as if someone had just reached out and given it a soft tug. The next morning, light slanted through the high windows of the orphanage, looking like a layer of frost on the floor. The children sat in a circle on low stools, surrounded by scraps of colored paper and crayons. They were singing Happy Birthday. Their voices were out of sync, some off-key, some trailing off into silence as they stared at the floor. Nobody knew who the song was for. Nobody asked. I stood outside the circle, leaning against the wall. My white shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing a scar on my arm from a stray nail. I didn't smile, and I didn't frown. I just watched them. Jiang Jin sat at the piano. He wasn't playing. His left hand rested on the keys while his right sat on his knee, his knuckles bruised from a recent collision with a doorframe. The silver bell sat on the piano, looking like a forgotten relic. When the song ended, there was no applause. A small boy walked up to me and handed me a drawing. It showed a boy in a white shirt standing behind a door, holding a lamp. The lamp was just a smudge of gray pencil. I took the drawing. The paper was wrinkled, as if it had been soaked in water and then dried. It was ugly. I nodded and taped it to the far right of the wall. The tape went on crooked. Then the second child brought a drawing. Then the third. 30 drawings in total, all showing the same thing. The door, the boy, the lamp. And on the back of every single one, the same sentence was written in pencil. Thank you for not giving up on yourself. I flipped through them one by one. My finger lingered on the paper, wanting to wipe away the dust, but I stopped myself. The last drawing was from a little girl with a scar behind her ear. She had drawn 2 boys behind the door, one holding the lamp, the other looking at the ground. The light from the lamp fell over both their feet. I looked up. Jiang Jin was teaching a child how to play a note. The boy's fingers were stiff, hitting a single, flat tone. Jiang Jin didn't rush him. He just gently moved the boy's hand back and played a low note, then a high one. He repeated it 3 times. On the 4th try, the boy played it. It was the wrong note, but he didn't pull his hand away. Jiang Jin didn't praise him. He just took an eraser from his pocket and cleaned the pencil lead off the boy's hand, then pushed the silver bell toward him. I walked toward the back door. The latch was loose, rattling as I touched it. I didn't open it. I just stood there, looking at the gray sky and the low clouds. The wind smelled like damp earth. I remembered that night years ago. Jiang Jin had lit a paper lantern behind the house. The paper was made from an old calendar page, October 1992. The lantern was clumsy, the wax dripping into a messy glob on the paper. There was only one thing written inside in faint pencil, as if the writer was afraid the wind would blow the words away. Lu Fen, November 3rd, 1992. I hadn't been born yet, not really. I had just stood behind the window, watching that tiny light flicker in the wind. It looked like it was about to go out, but it never did. Eventually, the flame died on its own, and the ashes fell to the ground, mixing with the dew to become nothing more than a small patch of black mud. Lu Fen didn't tell Jiang Jin the truth. He kept it buried, a cold weight in his chest. He knew his official birthday, March 17, 1993, was a lie manufactured by his father to cover up the swap. The real date was November 3rd, 1992. When he was a child, A nurse had mentioned he must have been born in the winter because of a fever he had, and his father had noted it down. Later, when he asked his mother, she only told him he was born to burn away lies. He used to think that was a curse. Now, looking at the diary, he realized it was a confession. He was the stolen child. The real Lu Fun was Jiang Jin, the baby in the basement who never cried. He stood by the back door, motionless. The wind whistled through the gaps, tugging at his sleeves, which were still stained with dust from fixing the children's easels earlier that morning. He turned back into the room without a word. He began retaping the 30 drawings on the wall, one by one. He was meticulous. He made sure the tape was flatter and smoother than it had been before. When he finished the last one, he turned to see Jiang Jin standing by the piano. Jiang Jin held the silver bell, staring at it. He didn't look at Lu Fun. He just placed the bell back on the keys and walked toward the door. He left it slightly ajar. The wind blew in, rustling the drawings. The shadows of the boys in the pictures seemed to dance on the wall. Lu Fun followed him, stopping a step behind. Jiang Jin didn't turn around. "Do you remember?" Lu Fun asked. Jiang Jin didn't answer. "When you were little, did you used to wake up in the middle of the night? Did you hear someone singing half a song?" Jiang Jin's hand froze on the doorframe. A dried scab on his knuckle cracked, a tiny bead of red oozing out. Lu Fun asked if he remembered the tune. Still, Jiang Jin said nothing. He simply pushed the door shut, the latch clicking softly into place. He walked down the steps toward the backyard where the ashes of the paper lantern remained. Lu Fun didn't follow. He felt weak, his legs heavy. He sat at the piano, staring at the silver bell. He didn't touch it. Instead, he picked up a drawing a little girl had left behind. On the back, underneath a thank you note, was a line of tiny, faint pencil marks. It was almost invisible. "Mom says your name is Jiang Jin. You are the fire growing from the ashes." He stared at those words for a long time. Outside, a sparrow landed near the curtain, pecking at dry grass. The wind stirred the fabric of the twin vine screen, moving like a mother's hand brushing over a child's shoulder. Lu Fun stood up, picked up a broken blue crayon, and finished the drawing of the lamp behind the door. He didn't draw light. He only drew a circle of gray. He walked to the door and looked out at the pile of black ash in the yard. The wind caught it, scattering the remains into the grass and the mud until they vanished. Inside the house, the silver bell sat silent on the piano. No one touched it. The wooden stairs to the attic groaned under Lu Fun's weight. A clump of dried mud fell from his shoe, a remnant from digging the drainage ditch that morning. He didn't care. In the corner of the attic, a mirror was draped in black cloth, buried under a thick layer of dust. The fabric was riddled with holes from insects. As the wind breathed through the window cracks, the cloth fluttered like a living thing. Lu Fun knelt and wiped the glass with his sleeve. The fabric was worn thin, the cotton stuffing peeking through the seams. It took 3 passes to clear the grime. The frame was old elm, cracked and bound with rusted wire that flaked off at the slightest touch. He didn't pull the cloth away fully yet. His fingers traced the edge of the frame, feeling the deep, dense grooves carved into the wood. They weren't natural marks. They were names. Hundreds of tiny, ant-like characters crowded the grain, leaving no space between them. He counted them twice. 47 names. His throat tightened, but he didn't look away. Jiang Jin stood at the top of the stairs, holding a piece of paper that looked like it had been soaked and dried. He didn't come closer. His shadow stretched long across the floor. Lu Fun looked up at him, then reached out and tore the black cloth away. The mirror reflected his own face, pale, with deep shadows under his eyes. But he wasn't looking at himself. He was looking at the list Jiang Jin handed him. The paper was brittle. The handwriting was his mother's, tight, cramped, as if she were afraid someone would see it, or afraid she would forget. Lu Fun scanned the list. There it was. Number 17, Lu Fun. Next to the name was a drawing of the twin vines. 2 stalks intertwined, one thick and one thin. One flower was in full bloom, the other was a closed bud. The ink was faded, traced over in pencil multiple times before being finalized in pen. Lu Fun gripped the paper until his knuckles turned white. He didn't tear it, but his nail left a sharp dent in the corner. Jiang Jin stood behind him, silent, his gaze fixed on the scar on Lu Fun's back. a mark from a rusty nail he'd caught while fixing a door the year before. Lufin stood up slowly, like he was lifting a mountain. He grabbed the heavy base of the mirror and began hauling it down the stairs. The wood bumped against the railing, knocking loose splinters that fell onto his feet. He didn't stop. Jiang Jin followed him down, but didn't offer to help. In the main hall, sunlight slanted through the high windows like a layer of frost. The children were huddled in the corners, silent. Some were fiddling with candy wrappers. Others were scraping mud off their shoes and lining it up on the floor. Lufin hung the mirror on the wall facing the door. It was too high, so he balanced on a wobbly stool, his hand leaving a dusty print on the wall. Jiang Jin held out a rusted nail, but Lufin ignored it, pulling a new one from his toolkit instead. He hammered it in. 3 strikes, and it went crooked. He pulled it out and tried again. On the 4th strike, it held. He stepped back and stood tall. The children didn't look up. A boy in a blue vest continued drawing circles on the floor until his crayon snapped. Lufin turned toward the piano, the silver bell still resting on the keys. He looked at the children, his voice low but clear in the absolute silence of the room. "This isn't just a mirror," he said. He paused, the sound of falling dust almost audible. "It's a container for memories. From today on, your past will no longer be hidden in the dark." No one moved. No one nodded. Then, a girl of about 6 or 7 in a faded red sweater stood up. She didn't look at the mirror or at Lufin. She walked to the wall and stood on her tiptoes, taping her drawing just below the glass. It was the picture of the boy in the white shirt holding the gray lamp. She held her hand against the wall for a moment, the tape fluttering in the breeze. Lufin watched her, but said nothing. Jiang Jin walked up to the mirror and stopped, staring at everything except his own reflection. I didn't look at the names. I reached out, my fingertips brushing against the cool surface of the mirror. It was covered in a thin layer of dust. I wiped it 3 times, but the streaks remained. I turned toward the door, the soles of my shoes still caked with yellow mud. Lufin didn't stop me. I reached the doorway and rested my hand on the handle. I didn't push. Looking down, I saw the mud on my toes had dried and cracked into jagged pieces. I stood there, frozen. Lufin walked to the piano and picked up the silver bell. It didn't ring. He held it tight and gave it a gentle shake. Still silence. He placed the bell back on the keys, centering it perfectly so it faced the mirror. Outside, the wind picked up. A draft whistled through the door frame, tugging at one of the drawings that wasn't taped down securely. The corner of the paper curled up, fluttering against the wall. Neither of us moved. 30 drawings lined the room, every single one depicting the same boy, the same door, and the same unfinished lamp. On the floor, the girl's 5 circles sat next to a 6th, half-drawn one. The mirror reflected it all, the walls, the piano, the bell, and the stubborn dust I couldn't wipe away. No one spoke. The wind crept through the window gaps, rippling the surface of a half-finished glass of water on the table. A faint, white ring had dried around the rim. Later, I found the 64th item, an unfinished letter. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the parchment. It was brittle, feeling like it had been soaked in salt water and dried in the sun. I didn't turn on the light. I used the pale moonlight leaking through the window to read. The ink was so faded it was almost gone, but the brushstrokes were steady. The hand that wrote this hadn't shaken. "Before your mother died, she gave me the key. She knew you would come back. Do not trust her." It was signed, Lin Wan. I sat in the car, motionless. Back at the house, the tea from yesterday was still on the table. That same white water ring stared back at me. I watched it for 10 minutes before looking up at Lufin. He was standing by the door, refusing to come in. He was wearing his white shirt from yesterday, sleeves rolled up to reveal the scar on his forearm. His shoes were still covered in mud from the backyard drainage ditch. The mud had dried into flakes, looking like pieces of broken pottery. "You read it?" Lufin asked. "Yeah. Where's the letter?" I didn't hand it over. I folded it twice and tucked it into my pocket, my movements light, as if I were afraid of waking something up. "Who is Lin Wan?" I asked. "My father's nurse," Lufin said. 20 years ago, he vanished from the hospital. No one knew where he went. Lufin didn't say anything else. He walked to the table and stared at the water stain on the glass. He reached out, his finger hovering just above the rim, but he didn't touch it. He used to be a child psychologist, Lufin added, a specialist in trauma caused by experimental instruments. I stayed still, watching Lufin's hand. There was a tiny splinter of wood on his knuckle, likely from the door frame at the clinic. You investigated him? I asked. When? The day you went to the House of Light to hand out flyers. I turned away and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. The sun wasn't fully up yet. The clouds were low, and the wind blowing in from the sea smelled of salt. There were 3 shallow scratches on the windowsill where I had scraped my keys last year. They weren't deep, but they wouldn't go away. He lives by the sea, Lufin said. Behind the old fishing port in East Bay. A small shack with gray walls. The door lock is broken. He never fixed it. I turned to look at him. You've been there? No, but I saw the photos. The landlord says he never speaks. He just sits by the window every day, watching the ocean. Lufin stopped talking. He picked up the old tea and poured it into the sink. The sound of the water was soft, like a distant sigh. We didn't pack bags. We only took the letter and an old umbrella. By the time we reached East Bay, the sky was a pale, bruised gray. The sea wind whipped sand against the car windows, a sound like soft tapping. The shack sat at the top of a slope. Gray walls, a tin roof, and a crooked wooden door. The bolt was loose. It creaked the moment I pushed it. There was no electricity. Faded blue curtains hung limp over the windows. A man sat in a wooden chair by the glass. Lin Wan. He was as thin as crumpled paper, his hair completely white and tangled down to his shoulders. His eyes were bright but lacked focus. He didn't look at us. He just stared at the waves. Lufin stayed at the threshold. I walked in, my shoes crunching softly on the dusty floorboards. I knelt in front of him and placed the letter on his lap. He didn't move, but his fingers began to fumble over his knees, feeling for something invisible. I waited 5 minutes. Then, I took a pencil and paper from my bag and set them beside him. He didn't take them at first. After a moment, his hand lifted, his fingertips brushing the pencil before slowly gripping it. He drew with agonizing slowness. The pencil scratched against the paper like a crawling insect. He drew 2 boys. One was in a cage with thick iron bars and a heavy lock at the bottom. The other sat on a golden throne. The throne was ornate, but he only finished the outline. Standing between them was a woman in a long dress, holding 2 keys. One was copper, one was iron. He finished and dropped the pen. A single tear fell, blurring the lead into a gray smudge. He wiped his face with his left hand, then picked up the pencil with his right. At the bottom of the drawing, he wrote 1 stroke at a time, asterisk I saved you. I couldn't save the other, asterisk. The handwriting was crooked, but every stroke was pressed hard into the paper, as if he wanted to carve the words into existence. Lufin watched from the doorway, his eyes fixed on his own shoes. The mud on his toes had crumbled further, leaving small debris on the threshold. I stared at the writing for a long time. Finally, I reached out and touched the back of Lin Wan's hand. His skin felt like old, cold paper. Are you? My voice cracked. Are you him? He didn't look up. He just used his fingernail to slowly scrape a tiny piece of paper debris away from the word, I. The scrap fell onto his knee like a speck of ash. Lufin finally walked in, standing behind me. He didn't look at the drawing or the man. His eyes were locked on an old iron box in the corner. The lid was slightly ajar, revealing the corner of a yellowed envelope. It bore the Lu family crest, the twin vines. He knelt beside it, but didn't touch it. Lin Wan suddenly looked up. It was a brief glance, but it made Lufin freeze. The old man's lips moved. No sound came out, but the shape was clear, fun. Lufin didn't move. He stood up slowly and backed away, hitting the door frame. The loose bolt rattled at the impact. I remained focused on the drawing. Lin Wan raised his hand, pointing at the golden throne in the sketch. Then, with his other hand, he slowly pulled a key from his sleeve. It was identical to mine. He placed the key on the drawing, right at the foot of the throne. Then he closed his eyes, his head drooping slowly as if he had drifted off to sleep. The room went silent, save for the wind rhythmically snapping the curtains against the frame. I picked up the key. I didn't say a word. I laid it on the table next to my own. The 2 keys sat side by side, looking like a pair of separated locks finally reunited. Lu Fen walked to the window and pulled the curtain wide. Sunlight finally broke through, hitting the metal with a copper flash. He didn't look at the keys. He looked outside. A fishing boat was swaying slowly in the distance, leaving a white trail in its wake. He reached out and shut the window. The wind died. The silence deepened. I walked over to Lin Wan and gently pulled a thin, gray blanket over his legs. I stood there for a moment, then turned toward the door. "Ready?" I asked. Lu Fen didn't look back. "Yeah." We didn't speak again. As we left, the door bolt gave one last creak. Outside, the sun beat down on the gray walls. A dead crab lay in the corner, its shell cracked, its legs curled tight. I stepped over it without stopping. Lu Fen looked back one last time. Lin Wan hadn't moved. The drawing was still on his lap, the key pinning down the golden throne as the door stood open to the sea. I knelt in front of Lin Wan's old wooden chest. My fingers dug into the rusted nails at the corner, prying away the last loose floorboard. Underneath, there was a layer of yellowed oilcloth. Resting on top of it was a copper key. It was slightly thicker than the one I held, but the teeth were identical. Even the small dent on the bottom right corner matched perfectly. I didn't say a word. I just placed the two keys side by side on the edge of the chest. Sunlight sliced through the gap in the window, hitting the copper surface and reflecting a dull, greenish glint. The keys didn't move. Neither did I. Inside the chest, I found a hardbound notebook. The cover read, March 1998 to July 2001. The handwriting belonged to Lin Wan. The strokes were pressed deep into the paper, as if she had traced over the letters with a pencil again and again. I didn't open it. I just slid the keys into my pocket. When I stood up, my knee hit the bottom of the chest, letting out a dull thud. The basement door was tucked away in the westernmost corner of the backyard, hidden behind a pile of firewood and rusted iron barrels. The door was metal, its paint peeling in large flakes like dried fish scales. The lock was an old-fashioned double keyhole style. The two keys fit perfectly. Lu Fen stood 3 steps behind me. He didn't move. His sleeves were still stained with mud from yesterday's digging. His left shoe was cracked, and a clump of dried dirt fell from his toe, shattering into 3 pieces on the ground. He watched me insert the keys. He didn't ask questions, and he didn't rush me. The keys turned silently. The lock was choked with dust, jammed tight. I scraped at it with my fingernail and blew into the mechanism. The door hinges let out a low, heavy groan, sounding like a rusted chain being dragged across stone. The door swung open. There was no light inside. The air was cold, smelling of rust and mildew. I felt along the wall for a switch and flipped it. The fluorescent tube flickered 3 times before humming to life. The walls were bare concrete, but they were covered in clippings. Hundreds of newspapers. The dates spanned from 1997 to 2005. Every single one was about the kidnapping of Lu Fen, the heir to the Lu family. Each article was neatly cut, the corners secured with tape. Underneath each one, numbers were written in red ink. Ransom, 5 million. April 12, 2001. Ransom, 8 million. January 8, 2002. Ransom, 12 million. July 3, 2004. The last one was from 2005. It said, ransom paid. Hostage returned safely. That was the day Lu Fen was sent back to the Lu family. Lu Fen didn't come closer. He stood at the doorway, staring at the very bottom clipping. The photo showed him at 6 years old, wearing a white shirt, being held up by 2 men in black suits. His head was turned away, his eyes closed. The caption read, Lu Group heir, Lu Fen, rescued. His throat moved, but he didn't speak. I walked to the end of the room. There, on a small table, sat an old tape recorder. Next to the machine sat a single cassette tape. I didn't hesitate. I pressed play. Click. Hiss. Then, his father's voice echoed through the cold room. It was slow, sounding like water seeping out from underground. Lu Fen is a fake. A 5-second pause followed. The real heir is Jiang Jin. Another 7 seconds of silence. There was a faint sound of breathing, as if the speaker were waiting for something. But only by making Lu Fen believe he is the real one can he carry all the sins for me. The recorder stopped. The static continued to hiss like wind blowing through an empty house. I didn't move. I looked down at the label. My name, Jiang Jin, was written there, but it looked distorted. It made my skin crawl. Lufin walked over slowly. He didn't look at the recorder or the clippings on the wall. He knelt by the table and picked up a key from the floor, his own key, which he must have dropped. He gripped it so hard his knuckles turned white. So he said. His voice was very soft, as if he were afraid of waking something up. Even my kidnapping was just part of the script. He didn't cry. He didn't break anything. He just squeezed the key in his palm, stood up slowly, and turned toward the door. I didn't stop him. Lufin paused at the doorway. There was a faint scratch on the frame, a mark he had carved with a pencil when he was a child. It said, Lufin was here. The mark was covered in dust now, but the strokes were still visible. He reached out and rubbed it with his thumb. The dust fell away. He didn't wipe his hand. He didn't look back. He just walked out. The basement light stayed on. I didn't turn it off. I stood there for 3 minutes, watching the corners of the newspaper clippings curl in the draft. It felt like the past was flipping its own pages behind my back. Finally, I shut off the light. In the darkness, the tape was still spinning. The hissing didn't stop. I didn't pull the tape out. I just closed the iron door with a heavy thud. In the backyard, the wind blew in from the sea, carrying the scent of salt. A sparrow landed on an iron barrel near the woodpile, pecked at the rust twice, and flew away. Lufin was sitting on the stone steps, his back against the wall. He wasn't looking at the sky or the ground. He just had the 2 keys side by side on his knees. He was counting the teeth of the keys, one by one, with his finger. The mud on his sleeve had dried completely, cracking into pieces like old clay. I walked over, carrying 2 cups of tea. One was hot, the other was cold. I didn't ask which one he wanted. I put the hot one in front of him and kept the cold one by my feet. There was a long crack in the stone step, running from right to left as if split by an axe. The teacup sat right on the crack, perfectly balanced. Neither of us spoke. The wind blew a withered leaf onto Lufin's shoe. It stayed there. After a long time, I finally spoke. That drawing Linwan made. Do you remember it? Lufin didn't answer. 2 boys, I said. One locked in a cage, one sitting on a golden throne. He only remembered one thing. He said, I saved one of you. Lufin looked down at the keys on his knees. He didn't say which one he saved. He didn't, I agreed. The wind died down. The leaf slid off his shoe and fell into the crack of the stone step. Lufin reached out, swept the 2 keys into his palm, and clenched his fist. He stood up without looking at me and walked into the house. I stayed where I was. I took a sip of my tea. It was cold and tasteless. Inside the house, the recorder was still spinning. The hiss of the tape leaked through the door frame like a heartbeat. I didn't follow him. I looked up at the sky. The clouds were low, pressing down on the sea. In the distance, a ship's horn blared. Once, then twice, distorted and broken. I set the empty cup on the step, stood up, and brushed the dust off my pants. As I walked back into the living room, I saw Lufin standing in front of the mirror. It was uncovered now. The 47 names were still there, crowded around the wooden frame like ants. Lufin wasn't looking at the names. He was looking at his own reflection. He stared for a long time. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the 2 keys, and placed them gently into a groove at the bottom corner of the mirror frame. They fit perfectly, seamless. He didn't move. I stood at the doorway, watching him. Outside, the wind picked up again, tugging at the curtains and revealing a corner of the gray wall. There was a fresh scratch there from when Lufin had moved the mirror yesterday. No one fixed it. No one mentioned it. The teacup was still sitting on the stone step, ice cold. The recorder was still spinning. Asterisk hiss. Hiss. Asterisk it sounded like someone was breathing right next to us. Chapter 66. The Witness in the Ashes. When the live stream light flickered on, Lufin didn't look at the camera. He was sitting on an old wooden chair in the basement. The chair was missing a piece of one leg, propped up by half a brick. The tape recorder sat on his lap. Its plastic shell had 3 cracks, held together by layers of old tape. He pressed play. The voice came through, his father's voice, sounding like a tape that had been soaked in water and then dried out. In the background, there was the steady, rhythmic sound of dripping water. Funner, I'm sorry, the voice said. Jeaner, don't hate me. He repeated it 7 times. There was no sobbing, no trembling. It sounded like a mantra, like a script being recited. The live stream showed nothing but the recorder and the hand holding it. His sleeve was rolled up, revealing an old scar on his forearm. There was still mud under his fingernails from the drainage ditch. His left shoe was cracked, and the dirt at his feet had shattered into 3 pieces. No one spoke. No one asked questions. By the 7th repetition, the comments section began to explode. Who is this? The Liu family? The one who sold the child? That recorder is a 1998 model. Is that a basement? Why isn't he talking? Is he? We were waiting for something, though I didn't know what. By 3:17 a.m., the view count on the live stream hit 50 million. By 4:02 a.m., the official website for the UN Children's Bureau updated with a massive announcement. The headline was about the House of Light. It was a full investigation report into a systemic child trafficking and identity swapping ring that had operated from 1989 all the way to 2023. Attached to the report were photos. Children were locked in iron cages, their faces blurred, but their birth dates and hospital ID numbers were clear as day. There were bank statements from international adoption agencies. The recipient of all that money was the Liu Family Charity Foundation. The media exploded. Reporters swarmed the gates of the House of Light, thrusting microphones into the air and screaming Liu Fun's name. Security couldn't hold them back. People were scaling the walls and climbing the iron gates. Drones buzzed through the sea breeze, their cameras sweeping over the courtyard, capturing images of children's socks hanging on clotheslines and old toys piled in corners. Inside, Liu Fun didn't go out. He shut down the live stream and pulled the power cord. The tape recorder was still on. The voice had stopped, but the machine hummed with a low vibration, sounding like a restless insect. He walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just a fraction. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. The clouds hung low, and a salty wind blew in from the ocean. A half-finished cup of cold tea sat on the windowsill. The water had evaporated, leaving a chalky white ring around the rim. He didn't touch it. Jiang Jin was standing by the door. He was wearing the same gray coat from yesterday, the cuffs worn white. There was still a layer of dust on his sleeve from when he had been folding paper cranes. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at Liu Fun. He just gripped a square piece of paper in his hand, its edges frayed. You heard it, Liu Fun said, his back still turned. Yeah. Did you know all along? I didn't. Then why didn't you ask? Jiang Jin didn't answer. He folded the paper twice and tucked it into his inner pocket. His movements were incredibly light, as if he were afraid of waking something up. Suddenly, the noise outside went silent for a heartbeat before erupting into a frenzy. Someone screamed, "It's him! That old man! He's here! He's kneeling!" Liu Fun turned around. Jiang Jin had already reached the door, his hand resting on the handle, but he didn't push it open. Through the crack in the door, I could see the red light of a camera glowing like an eye that refused to blink. An old man with white hair was kneeling on the concrete outside. He wore a faded blue cloth shirt, his hands pressed against the ground and his forehead resting on his palms. When he looked up, his wrinkles looked like cracked mud. His eyes were cloudy, but they locked onto Liu Fun with terrifying precision. I was an accomplice to the traffickers back then, the old man rasped. His voice sounded like sandpaper rubbing against iron. I sold 3 of them. One was Jiang Jin. He pointed a trembling finger at Jiang Jin. He was only 3 years old. His mother died in the delivery room. His father was the Liu family's driver. They said the child wouldn't survive and told me to get rid of him. I took the money and sent him to the House of Light. Later they said they needed to swap the kids. They wanted to give him Liu Fun's identity. The old man gasped for air and coughed, a thin spray of blood hitting the ground like a dried-up stain. I regretted it, he whispered. I wanted to steal him back, but he was too quiet. He didn't cry. He didn't make a sound. He didn't recognize anyone. I was scared he'd recognize me. He lowered his head again, his forehead touching his palms. He isn't a child of the Liu family. He belongs to the Jiangs. Outside the frame, Jiang Jin closed his eyes. He didn't cry. He just stood there, looking like a tree stump that had been battered by the wind for a decade. Liu Fun didn't move either. He looked down at his own hands. The mud was still under his fingernails. The dust was still on his sleeves. The clump of dirt on his shoe had shattered into 3 pieces, and he hadn't swept it away. He didn't look at Jiang Jin, and he didn't look at the camera. He picked up the recorder and walked to a corner of the basement where a pile of old newspapers sat. They were all clippings about Lu Fen's kidnapping. He tucked the recorder at the very bottom, underneath the oldest paper. The date on it was April 12, 2001. The headline read, "Lu family heir missing, 5 million ransom paid." He stood up and brushed the dust off his pants. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Jiang Jin was still standing there. Lu Fen stopped half a step away from him. Through the door, reporters were still screaming Jiang Jin's name, asking if he had anything to say. Jiang Jin kept his eyes shut. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out that square piece of white paper. He unfolded it and handed it to Lu Fen. A single name was written on it, Jiang Jin. He placed the paper gently into Lu Fen's palm. Lu Fen didn't look at the paper. He looked at his own hand. There were calluses from carving wood as a child and an old scar from when his hand had been caught in an iron gate at age 7. He folded the paper back up. Then he turned and walked down the stairs. His footsteps echoed against the concrete, one heavy thud at a time. Jiang Jin opened his eyes, but didn't follow. He just watched Lu Fen's back disappear around the corner. Outside, the reporters kept shouting. The old man kept kneeling. The red light of the camera stayed on. The basement light was still burning, and the recorder was still humming. From the corner, the sound of dripping water continued. Drip, drip. The wind blew in from the sea, bringing the salt. The teacup on the windowsill was bone dry now, leaving nothing but that white ring. No one wiped it away. No one poured it out. The cup just sat there, empty and silent, as if nothing had happened. But the door latch had come loose. When the wind hit it, it rattled softly. Later, we went to the backyard of the House of Light. An old locust tree stood there, its branches draped in iron wire. Whenever the wind blew, hundreds of paper cranes swayed. The children used to squat on the concrete, folding scrap paper into wings and writing their names in pencil before hanging them up. There were so many cranes that they bumped into each other like a flock of birds that refused to fly. Lu Fen sat on a low stool with a crumpled piece of paper spread out in front of him. The edges were water-stained, and the writing was blurred. He didn't use colors, just a dull pencil. He folded the paper once, then again, creating a crooked crane. On its wing, he wrote 4 words, "Living for you." He wrote slowly, as if he were carving the words into stone. Jiang Jin sat next to him in silence. He folded his cranes quickly, each one identical, each wing perfectly symmetrical. He wrote names on his, Lin Xiaoman, Chen Anan, Zhou Yutong. These were the names of the children confirmed dead in the investigation report. He didn't write dates or ages, just the names, like a row of tombstones missing their epitaphs. A little girl in a blue shirt squatted nearby, clutching a torn piece of paper. She looked up at Lu Fen, not saying a word, not crying. She just stared at his pencil. Lu Fen looked at her and handed it over. She took it without a thank you and went back to folding. Lu Fen folded 47 cranes. He counted them one by one. When he hit 47, he stopped. He put the pencil back in his pocket, his sleeves covered in gray dust from helping the kids sweep the floor. He stood up. He walked toward the clinic, leaving Jiang Jin behind to finish the rest. He stopped at the door of the child psychologist. A 5-year-old boy was inside, his hair a mess and scratches on his face. He had just been transferred from the orphanage yesterday. He was hugging his knees, refusing to let anyone touch him. If anyone got close, he would scream. The nurse said he wouldn't talk. He would only cry until he was dehydrated. Lu Fen stood in the doorway for 3 minutes, unmoving. The sunlight cut across the floor in a sharp diagonal line. He finally walked in. He didn't say a word. He just knelt down, keeping his hands exactly 10 centimeters away from the boy. The boy's crying hit a sudden halt. He looked up, his eyes red and his nose running. Lu Fen didn't reach out to wipe his face. He didn't ask any questions. He just slowly shifted forward, his knees scraping the floor, his hands open and still. Waiting. The boy stared at Lu Fen's hand for 5 seconds. Suddenly, he lunged forward. He grabbed Lu Fen's arm, burying his face in the sleeve, and began to sob even harder. Lu Fen didn't pull away. He looked down, watching the gray dust from his sleeve rub off onto the boy's hair. He reached out and gently patted the boy's back. 1, 2. The rhythm was uneven. I'm here, Lufin said. I'm not leaving. The boy didn't loosen his grip. He only held on tighter, his tears soaking into the fabric until a dark, damp patch spread across the sleeve. I stood in the doorway, unmoving. I watched Lufin's back and the boy's feet. The kid was wearing old slippers, and the left strap was broken, held together by a single rubber band. I turned away, pulled the silver bell from my pocket, and hung it on the iron frame of the boy's bed. It dangled 3 inches from the edge. When the wind blew, it swayed gently, but it didn't make a sound. That night, Lufin didn't return to the dorms. He sat on a long bench in the pediatric psychology wing. By 11 o'clock, the lights were out. Only the green emergency light on the wall stayed on, casting long, eerie shadows. There was a knock on the door. Before he could answer, a note was slid underneath. It was a scrap of paper with curled edges, the handwriting light and airy, as if it might blow away. You aren't what they say you are, it read. You are more of a father than they can imagine. Lufin didn't move. He held the note in his hand, but didn't look at it a second time. He stuffed it into his pocket next to the pencil. The pocket bulged, the pencil pressing against his thigh as he sat there. Early the next morning, before the sun was fully up, Lufin went back to the room. The boy was still asleep, face pressed against the pillow, his eyelashes still damp. The silver bell hung motionless. Lufin stood by the bed for 5 minutes. He didn't touch the child. He didn't say a word. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the paper cranes were still tied to the wire mesh. The wind had died down, and they hung limp, like they were sleeping too. He reached out and plucked one off. The name Zhou Yutong was written on the wing. He squeezed it, but he didn't tear it or throw it away. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. Without looking back, he walked out. I was leaning against the wall at the end of the hallway, holding a plastic cup of water. There were bite marks on the rim. The cup was half empty. Lufin walked up to me. I looked at him, but didn't ask anything. He pulled the paper crane out and placed it in my palm. I looked down at it. You folded these, Lufin said. I remember all the names. I didn't respond. I gently placed the crane back into his hand, turned, and set the water cup on a nearby table. A ring of moisture formed on the wood, looking like an amber stain on a map. I walked away to organize the children's clothes. The small jackets on the hangers were frayed at the cuffs, the collars crooked. No one had bothered to fix them. Lufin stood where he was, his hand still open. The crane didn't move. A breeze drifted in from the back window, ruffling the paper wings and finally catching the silver bell on the doorframe. It let out a single, soft ring. It sounded like a quiet sigh. A nurse pushed a cleaning cart past the end of the hall, the wheels squeaking as they rolled over a wet patch. Lufin didn't move, and I didn't look back. The sun rose, shining on the wire mesh, the silver bell, and the half-finished cup of water. Later, we found the tin biscuit box. It was hidden away, the lid covered in faded stickers and a wobbly drawing of a sun. It sat on the long table in the House of Light common room. One corner of the table was missing, propped up by a red brick. A few paper cranes were wedged into the cracks of the brick, covered in dried mud. When I pulled the cassette tape out of the box, my hand didn't shake. It was an old-fashioned tape with a cracked plastic shell and worn edges. The label was marked in pencil, October 12, 1999, March 2000. Below that, a single word me. The handwriting was blurred, as if it had been damaged by water. I didn't look at Lufin. I put the tape into the player and pressed play. The machine clicked. First, there was the hiss of static, like wind hitting a fence. Then came the coughing, ragged, intermittent, like someone gasping for air behind a wall. Then, a voice emerged, raspy and low, as if crawling up from underground. I hate Jiangjin. A 5-second silence followed, broken only by more coughing. He looks too much like him. Another pause. The breathing became heavy, like a bellows. But I'm afraid of him. I'm afraid he'll see right through me, just like he did. Lufin sat in an old sofa to the left. The leather was cracked, and a clump of dried mud fell from his heel. He didn't look at the screen. He just stared at the solid red light of the player. Funner, you love him for me. Love him in my place. Atone for my sins. The voice suddenly choked up, as if someone had grabbed his throat. There was a sound of muffled gasping. It wasn't crying. It was the sound of someone holding it in, like a child in a basement having their mouth covered. But you, why don't you hate me? The tape reached the end and clicked. The player began to auto-rewind, the rhythmic thump-thump sounding like a pendulum. I stood by the table, my right hand gripping the silver bell. It didn't ring, it was just cold against my palm. A little girl in a blue dress squatted by the table, clutching a piece of paper that was too thin and had torn. She pressed the edges together, not crying, not looking up. Lufin finally moved. He stood up, walked to the player, and hit the loop button without a word. The tape started again. I hate Jiangjin. The voice was identical, the rhythm of the coughing unchanged. The children began to gather around. No one spoke. Some squatted, some stood, others leaned against the peeling walls. One boy hugged his knees, wearing 2 different socks, one white, one gray. The red light stayed lit. The voice poured out of the old speakers over and over, neither loud nor soft, echoing the wind outside. Lufin sat back down on the sofa. He pulled out his pencil. The tip was dull. He looked down and began to scrape the lead with his fingernail, letting the gray dust fall onto his pants. I remained standing. I wasn't looking at Lufin or the children. I was watching the tape spin in the player. How long did he record for? I asked softly. No one answered. The tape kept playing. I hate Jiangjin. He looks too much like him. But I'm afraid of him. My thumb rubbed the edge of the silver bell. The metal was polished bright, as if someone had held it every single day. 3 months, Lufin said, his head down. The tape continued. Funner, love him for me. Atone for my sins. But you, why don't you hate me? Suddenly, the voice changed. It wasn't a cough or a sob anymore. It was a scream, forced out of the lungs with every bit of strength left. Jiangjin, come out. Dad wants to see you. The sound cut off. The tape hit the end. Click. The auto-rewind started again. Asterisk thump. Thump. Asterisk. The children didn't move. No one cried. No one asked questions. One boy leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. Lufin stood up and went to the window. The frame was loose, rattling in the wind. He pushed it gently. It didn't open, but the vibration shook a layer of dust from the sill like fine snow. I walked to the player. I didn't turn it off. Instead, I pulled a scrap of paper from my pocket, a leftover piece of folding paper with the name Lin Xiaoman written on it. I jammed it into the gap of the player. The paper caught, and the tape began to spin again. I hate Jiangjin. He looks too much like him. Funner, love him for me. Jiangjin, come out. Dad wants to see you. The voice cycled endlessly. Sunlight streamed through the window, hitting the long table, the tin box, and the silver bell. The bell didn't ring, but its shadow swayed. A child walked over, holding a newly folded paper crane. There was no name on the wings, only a small, hand-drawn circle. He stood on his tiptoes and placed it gently on the table. I hung the paper crane on the player's stand. It swayed, its paper wings brushing against the tape exit as the reels continued to spin. Lufin walked back to the sofa and sat down. He pulled a pencil from his pocket. The tip was blunt and worn. He rubbed it with his thumb, and a fine gray dust fell onto his knees. Jiangjin didn't move. He stood there, rooted to the spot, watching the player. He stared at the scrap of paper jammed in the gap and watched the sunlight crawl across the corner of the room, eventually hitting the table leg propped up by a red brick. The wind blew in from the west, tugging at the paper cranes hanging on the wire fence. They clinked softly, a tiny, brittle sound. One crane's wing had torn. It didn't fall, but hung there, dangling by a thread. The tape kept playing. Jiangjin, come out. Dad wants to see you. The voice cycled through the sunlight, over and over again. No one turned it off. No one spoke. Lufin lowered his head and slid the pencil back into his pocket. His cuffs were stained with dust from when he had swept the floor the day before. Jiangjin turned and walked toward the backyard. He didn't look back. On the fence, the paper cranes shivered in the wind. The red light on the player remained lit. Later, the workers were digging up the foundation when they hit something hard. It wasn't a stone, and it wasn't a normal tree root. The object was wound tight, coiled in the earth like a sleeping snake. It was shiny and black, but it crumbled the moment it was touched. As the dirt fell away, something grayish-white appeared. It was bone. The lead worker froze for 2 seconds. He knelt down and brushed the dirt away with his bare hands. The earth was choked with vines, the roots growing thick and aggressive. Wrapped in the center of them was a tiny, pitiful skeleton. 2 ribs were broken, and there was a crack in the skull. A silver tag hung from the chest. The writing was blurred by grime, but I could still make out the words. Jiangjin, November 3rd, 1992. The worker looked up to call for help, but he saw Lu Fen standing 10 feet away. Lu Fen's shoes were still caked with mud from sweeping the yard. A dried locust leaf was wedged into the crack of his left heel. Jiang Jin walked out of the house, clutching half a steamed bun left over from breakfast. He didn't look at the bones, nor did he look at the workers. He just stuffed the bun back into his pocket and knelt down. He didn't wear gloves. His fingers got stained with soil as he gently pulled at the vine roots. The vine snapped, oozing a pale green sap that dripped onto the concrete like dew. "It's him," Jiang Jin said. Lu Fen didn't move. He looked down at his own shoes. A clump of mud fell off, revealing his heel. There was rust embedded under his fingernails from fixing the wire fence yesterday. The worker tried to say something, but the leader pulled him back, retreating 5 steps. No one dared to move. The wind blew from the backyard, carrying the scent of freshly turned earth. It smelled slightly sweet, like rotting fruit. Jiang Jin picked up the bones one by one. His movements were slow, like he was tidying up scattered building blocks. Ribs, vertebrae, toe bones. He placed them all into an old tin urn. The box was a relic from the clinic, its lid decorated with a sun sticker that had yellowed and curled at the edges. He closed the lid but didn't snap it shut, leaving a small gap. "This isn't me," he said. Lu Fen finally looked up. Jiang Jin's eyelashes were dusted with soil, but he didn't wipe them. His eyes weren't red, and they weren't wet. He just stared at the gap in the lid as if he were waiting for something. "It's my mother," Jiang Jin continued. "After she gave birth to me, she was locked in the basement. For 3 years. She never stepped outside. On the final day, she set herself on fire. Her ashes were mixed into the vine seeds and scattered in the backyard." He stood up and brushed the dirt off his pants. They were old, the fabric at the knees worn white. There was a patch on the left pocket, the stitching crooked and messy, clearly done by his own hand. "She told me that when I came back, the vines would grow," he said. "They would hold the truth until someone dug them up." Lu Fen remained silent. He walked over to the roots, knelt, and touched a broken piece of the vine. The center was hollow, eaten away by time. He took a small piece and held it in his palm. "You knew all along," he said. Jiang Jin didn't answer. He cradled the urn in his arms and turned back toward the house. His steps were light, as if he were afraid of waking someone up. Lu Fen followed behind him. They walked through the corridor in single file. The light at the end of the hallway was broken, flickering half-heartedly. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing the gray concrete beneath, stained with dried watermarks that looked like salt frost. Jiang Jin stopped at the storage room. He reached into the bottom cabinet and pulled out a brass key. It was ancient, the teeth worn smooth. A faded red string was tied to the handle, stained with sweat and age. He placed the key on top of the urn. Lu Fen stared at it. He remembered that key. When they were kids, his father used it to lock the basement door. Every time Lu Fen tried to go near it, his father would take the key away and tell him, "You can't go in there. There are ghosts inside." Lu Fen had never asked who the ghost was. He walked over, knelt before the pile of dirt, and pulled a small trowel from his pocket, one he had borrowed to fix the flower beds yesterday and forgotten to return. He dug a hole and buried the key deep, pushing until his knuckles turned white. "You aren't being buried," he whispered. "You're being planted." The wind swirled through the backyard, kicking up dead leaves that stuck to the doorframe. Jiang Jin stood to the side, his gaze fixed elsewhere. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver bell. The copper clapper was worn shiny from years of handling. He didn't ring it. He just rubbed the metal with his thumb, over and over. Outside, the workers began clearing the roots. The sound of shovels hitting the dirt was rhythmic, like a pendulum. No one spoke. After a few minutes, Jiang Jin placed the bell inside the urn and snapped the lid shut tight this time. He turned toward the back door. The iron handle was rusted and groaned as he turned it. He pushed the door open, and sunlight flooded in, hitting the urn. The silver bell shifted slightly inside, but it made no sound. Lufin didn't follow him out. He sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall. An empty water cup sat in the corner, the rim marked with teeth indentations from a child. The water had long since evaporated, leaving a faint white ring. He looked at his hand. He was still clutching that piece of vine. It was dry and brittle. It snapped at the slightest pressure. He didn't throw it away. He put it in his pocket along with a piece of rust. Outside, the footsteps faded. The wind kept blowing, making the leaves hiss. Inside, the player was still spinning. His father's voice drifted out from the old machine in the corner, broken and distorted. Funner, love him for me, atone for my sins. But you? Why don't you ask me? Static. Interference. The sound of the wind through the wire fence. Lufin closed his eyes and didn't move. The cup in the corner remained empty. The teeth marks remained on the rim. Then, the door opened. The frame was made of new pine, still damp, with sawdust clinging to the edges. 30 children stood in a jagged line, holding hands. Some wore cloth shoes, some wore plastic, and some had rubber soles patched with clumsy stitches. Their heels were caked with mud. They didn't speak, and they didn't smile. They just stared at the door like they were waiting for an ending that was long overdue. Lufin stood to the left, his hand resting on the frame, his knuckles pressing into the grain of the wood. He wore a gray shirt today, the cuffs frayed. A button was missing, replaced by a temporary black thread that left a loose end hanging. Jiang Jin stood to the right in an old sweater, the collar stretched out to reveal a faint scar on his collarbone from a winter long ago. His right hand was in his pocket, clutching a handful of ash. The door was electric, prone to glitching. It started with a mechanical hum, like an old refrigerator compressor kicking to life. No one pressed a button, but the door moved anyway. There was a click as the gears engaged, slow and deliberate. Sunlight squeezed through the crack, first a thin line, then a ribbon, until the entire doorway was filled with a blinding gold, like someone had plastered the wall with gold leaf. On the wall hung 47 paintings. Every single one was of a door. But behind every door in those paintings, there was a light. Not a light made of paint, but a real, piercing glow. The light bled through the back of the drawing paper, warm and mundane. I watched as a reporter held up a painting, his voice trembling slightly as he looked between the two men. Mr. Liu, Mr. Jiang, which one of you is the true heir to the House of Light? Lufin didn't even glance at him. He kept his head down, pulling a brass key from his pocket. It was his mother's key. The teeth were worn down from years of use, and the name Lin Wan was engraved into the handle, the white lettering sunken and faded. He walked over to a 10-year-old girl standing nearby. She wore a blue cloth dress and was missing 2 fingers on her left hand. In her right, she clutched a paper crane with a broken wing, cotton stuffing leaking through the tear. Lufin knelt, his knees pressing into the dirt, kicking up a small cloud of dust. He placed the key in the girl's palm. You are the first one to open the door, he said softly. The girl stared at the key for 5 seconds. Then, she turned and placed her hand on the handle. The door swung open. Sunlight flooded out, hitting the wall where 47 painted doors hung. One by one, they seemed to ignite. The light wasn't hot, but standing in front of it felt like a phantom hand was gently pulling at my skin. Jiang Jin didn't look at the door or the girl. He turned his back to the light and walked away. A breeze drifted out from the crack in the door, smelling of dry earth and something sickly sweet, like rotting apples. He pulled a handful of ash from his pocket, the remains of the burnt will. It was charcoal black, flecked with unburnt ink. He tossed it into the air. The wind caught it, swirling the ash into the light before it could hit the ground. Lufin remained kneeling. He watched the girl disappear into the light, the door slowly clicking shut behind her. Only a sliver of a gap remained, casting a thin line of gold across the threshold. A few specks of dust danced in the beam, frozen in time. The reporter tried to ask another question, but his partner pulled him back, sensing the weight of the silence. I followed Jiang Jin to the backyard. He stood by a fresh pit where vines had been uprooted. The soil was damp and dark. Without gloves, he reached down and buried his fingers in the earth, feeling the broken roots. They were leaking a pale green sap that had dried like hardened dew. Lufin finally stood up and brushed the dirt and grass from his pants. He walked over, stopping 3 paces behind Jiangjin. He looked down at his own shoes. The heel of his left shoe was cracked, and a dried, blackened leaf was wedged in the gap. Jiangjin stood and wiped his hands, though the gray dust clung to his palms. In the distance, a black sedan emerged from behind the woods. Its lights were off, and the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. It moved slowly, passing by without a sound. Then, a window rolled down just an inch. An old, withered hand reached out and removed a pair of sunglasses. Behind them were eyes identical to Jiangjin's, though the corners were wrinkled and the whites were yellowed with age. The window rolled back up, and the car vanished into the shadows of the trees. The wind picked up again, and a little girl in a blue dress ran back out from the door, the brass key glinting in her hand. She ran to Lufin and looked up. "Which door does this open?" she asked. Lufin looked at her, but didn't answer. Jiangjin reached into his pocket and pulled out half a steamed bun left over from breakfast. He broke off a piece and handed it to her. She took it, didn't eat it, and ran back inside. The door shut again, leaving a shadow of a locust leaf stretched long and thin across the mud. Jiangjin looked at the sky. The clouds were still, but the wind swirled around an old tin urn nearby. It was Lin Wan's. The lid wasn't tight, and through the gap, I could see more gray ash, just like the ash from the well. Later, in a quiet corner of the library, Jiangjin sat by a window. Dust motes floated in the stagnant air. He found an old diary with no cover, its pages brittle and warped as if they had been soaked and dried a dozen times. He waited 3 minutes for the dust to settle before opening it. The handwriting belonged to Lufin's father. Heavy, sharp strokes that looked like they had been carved with a knife. April 12, 1998. Fun's birthday. The Lego spaceship I promised was replaced by blocks. He cried all afternoon, saying I lied. I didn't explain. He won't remember anyway. He flipped the page to 2001. Family photo. Fun looks just like his mother in this one. I burned it. When he asked where she was in the pictures, I told him he remembered wrong. He didn't ask again. Then, 2005. Lin once said before she died, "Don't let him know." I didn't tell him, but I've known all along. He didn't remember wrong. He left a letter hidden in the roots. I told the nurse to take the child away. Jiangjin's hand stopped. He didn't tremble. Outside, a sparrow pecked at the windowsill twice and flew away. He closed the diary and walked out. Lufin was in the basement. 3 candles were shoved into an old, rusty candy tin. Scattered on the floor were remnants of a life. A faded blue teddy bear with a missing ear, a first-place math trophy with water-damaged ink, and an old-school uniform stained with dark red spots that looked like dried mud. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just placed the bear on top of the pile and lit a flame. The fire crawled up the fabric. The candlelight flickered against the wall, revealing his cracked slippers and the black grease under his fingernails from fixing the pipes the day before. He picked up the uniform. As the fabric caught fire, it made a soft hissing sound, like a sigh. He stared into the flames, his eyes vacant. "Jiangjin," he whispered. His voice was thin, terrified of breaking the silence. It wasn't a shout or a curse. It was a plea. Jiangjin stood outside the door. He didn't move. He didn't answer. He just stood there with his hand in his pocket, clutching the warm ashes of a dead man's wishes. Inside, the fire reached the collar of the uniform, and for a moment, the shadows on the wall stretched and merged, making it look like 2 people were standing together, before the light flickered and pulled them apart again. Lufin reached for the last item, a small tin box with a fading sun sticker on the lid. He didn't open it. He threw it straight into the fire. The metal groaned as it heated, and the sun on the sticker turned black, looking as if someone had clawed it in half. The flames licked the ceiling, catching a spiderweb in the corner. Lufin stayed crouched on the floor, listening to his own shallow breath, counting the beats of a heart that had been broken long ago. Outside, Jiangjin lowered his head and walked into the dark. I looked down at my hands. Ash leaked through my fingers, falling onto the floor and gathering into a small, gray pile. I didn't sweep it up. At the top of the stairs, the light flickered twice. It didn't go out, but it struggled to stay alive. I turned and walked upstairs, my footsteps light against the wood. One plank was loose. It creaked once under my weight, then went silent. In the upstairs living room, a glass of water sat on the coffee table, unfinished from yesterday. A white, crusty ring had formed where the water had dried against the rim. Next to it lay half a steamed bun, cracked and stale, with a single sesame seed fallen near the corner of the table. Jiangjin walked past it without touching anything. He just gently pulled the door shut. The latch was loose, clicking into place like a rusty gear caught on grit. He didn't turn on the lights. Outside, the sky was bruising, the clouds hanging low enough to press against the roof. The wind blew in from the backyard, carrying the scent of wet earth and something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. He stood by the window for 5 minutes. Downstairs, the fire in the basement had died out. In the pile of ash, the remains of the tin box emitted a final, thin wisp of smoke. The smoke was gray and heavy. It didn't rise, but instead crawled along the floor, spreading slowly. Lufin hadn't come out. He was sitting on the ground, back against the wall, with that coverless diary resting on his knees. The fire hadn't touched him. He just lay there by the ashes, the yellowed pages of the book looking like a forgotten autumn leaf. His eyes were closed. He wasn't crying. The hallway light flickered again. This time, it stayed dark. At the end of the corridor, a door stood ajar. The wind whistled through the gap, stirring the dust. 47 doors lined the mental hallway of his mind, flickering with light that swayed as if someone had gently brushed against them. Then, everything went still. A rat scurried out from the basement ashes, clutching a charred scrap of a school uniform in its teeth. It ran fast and didn't look back. The world went completely dark. A girl sat on a low stool by the window. Her feet rested on an old towel, her toes still stained with mud. She gripped a pencil stub, using a piece of paper to slowly shave the wood down until only a tiny fragment of lead remained. No one spoke. The other children were asleep, but she was still drawing. Her paper was a scrap she'd found, the back printed with a milk powder brand. She drew with intense focus, the pencil scratching against the paper like a beetle gnawing on wood. Jiangjin walked in carrying a glass of warm milk. He didn't hand it to her. He just set it on a tin box by the windowsill. The lid wasn't closed tight, leaving a small gap. Steam drifted from the crack, curling around her hair before vanishing. He didn't ask what she was drawing. Lufin stood in the doorway. The second button on his gray shirt was loose again, the thread hanging down like an unsevered umbilical cord. He watched her for 3 minutes without moving. The draft from the door blew dust off her sleeve, mixing it with the grime already on the floor. "You're not her brother," the girl said suddenly. Her voice was tiny, squeezed out of her throat. It wasn't a question or a shout. She was talking to the wall. Jiangjin didn't move. The milk continued to steam. Lufin took a step forward, his shoe scuffing a patch of dried moss on the floorboards with a faint snap. He didn't look at the girl. He stared at the drawing. Behind a door in the picture were 2 children, one in a white shirt, one in gray. The white shirt had a crooked crease at the collar, as if someone had grabbed it with force. "You saw her," Lufin said. The girl didn't nod or shake her head. She put the pencil down and used her thumb to smudge the graphite, creating a blur of white. Then she looked up, her eyes locking onto Lufin's. "That night, you were blindfolded," she whispered. "They dragged you out from next door. They said you were dead. But I heard you crying. You cried like a puppy." Lufin's breath hitched for a second. He looked down at his hands. Black soot from yesterday's candles was still trapped under his fingernails. "Who dragged me?" "The ones in white coats," she said. "Your father." Jiangjin finally moved. He reached into his sweater pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. The corners were curled, and the seal was messy with dried glue, as if it had been opened and closed a dozen times. He didn't give it to Lufin. He placed it on the windowsill, half a foot away from the milk. "You're not her son," Jiangjin said. Lufin didn't respond. He stared at the envelope like it was a piece of red-hot iron. "Neither of us are her biological children," Jiangjin continued. Lufin's Adam's apple bobbed. He reached out, but he didn't take the envelope. Instead, he pushed the milk box away. The milk sloshed, a few drops spilling over the edge of the tin and dripping onto the floor, leaving dark, round spots. The girl picked up her pencil and went back to work. She was drawing a doorframe now, with a crack in the wood and a spider crawling inside. Finally, Lufin reached for the envelope. It was light, as if it held only a single sheet of paper or a handful of dust. He didn't open it there. He turned and walked back to the basement. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open. 3 candles were stuck inside a rusty tin can. The wax congealed at the bottom like dried blood. He knelt. He placed the envelope on the floor next to the blood-stained uniform, the faded teddy bear, and the water-damage certificate. He struck a match. The flame hissed to life. He didn't light the envelope. He lit the candles. The light jumped, illuminating his face. He didn't blink. Ash clung to his eyelashes. Jiang Jin stood at the door, but didn't enter. He was still holding a handful of ash from the burned will. It was still warm. He looked down at his shoes. A bit of mud from the garden was stuck to his left toe. The flame licked the corner of the envelope. The paper curled and blackened, the fire eating its way inward. Lufin watched, motionless. Shadows danced on the wall like 2 people performing a silent waltz. The door you drew, the girl's voice drifted in from outside, very soft. It's a real door. Lufin didn't look back. Jiang Jin didn't move. The fire died out, leaving only the 3 candle wicks glowing and trailing blue smoke. The envelope was half burned, but the words on the remaining scrap were still legible. Adoption Termination Agreement. Signatory, Lufin. Date, April 15, 1998. Lufin reached into the ashes and pulled out the fragment. The edges were charred black, but the center line was clear. Biological child confirmed dead. Replacement settled. Guardianship transferred to Jiang City. He held the paper. His hand didn't shake. He stood up, walked to the window, and pushed it open. The wind rushed in, flipping the girl's drawing over. On the back, a line of small handwriting appeared. Asterisk, I saw him being stuffed into a car. The car was black. License plate, L8721, asterisk. Lufin stared at those words for a long time. He said nothing. Jiang Jin walked over and stood behind him, not too close. He pulled a silver key from his pocket. The name, Lin Wan, was engraved on the handle, the letters crooked as if carved by a trembling hand. He placed the key in Lufin's palm. It was cold. Lufin didn't grip it, but he didn't let it go either. He just looked at the scratches on the metal. Outside, dawn was breaking. The clouds were thinning, letting in a pale, gray light. Downstairs, the caretaker was sweeping, the rhythm of the broom against the concrete making a dry, scratching sound. The girl was still drawing. She had drawn a door that was wide open. Behind the door, there was no light, only a single chair with a pair of small white shoes resting on it. The left lace was untied. Lufin turned and headed for the stairs. Jiang Jin didn't follow. He stood there, watching the half-burned scrap of paper catch the wind. It tumbled into the corner, snagging on a piece of loose wallpaper. He reached out to grab it, then stopped. He looked at his own hand, at an old scar from a winter chill that still itched. He didn't rub it. He turned and walked toward the library. The coverless diary was still on the table, open to the last page. Sunlight slanted through the window, hitting the final line. Funner, you are not my son, but you are the only person I ever dared to love. He closed the diary. He didn't put it back where it belonged. When he left, he pulled the door shut softly. The draft from the stairs kicked up a bit of dust, swirling it around the steps twice before it finally settled. The suitcase was dark brown. The corners were worn white, and the latch had broken long ago, held together now by a single piece of hemp rope. When I dragged it out from the very bottom of the wardrobe, 3 clouds of dust puffed up into my face. I didn't wipe them away. I didn't even turn on the light. The moonlight streaming through the window hit the lid perfectly, illuminating the wood grain that had cracked into deep lines, looking like a dried-up riverbed. I knelt there, my fingers tracing the bottom of the trunk until I reached the innermost layer. My nail scraped against a piece of stiff cardboard. I lifted it. Hidden underneath was a letter. It was written on old, lined notebook paper, the corners curled and the color yellowed, looking like tea leaves that had been soaked and then dried out. The handwriting was done with a left hand, crooked and shaky, as if the person writing it had been fighting against their own muscles. Gina, it read, your father lied to everyone. You aren't a bastard. You were the only thing he took from my womb. Lufin was just a replacement he bought from human traffickers. I didn't move. I flipped the letter over. Taped to the back was a slip of paper as thin as a cicada's wing, an obstetrics record dated April 12, 1998. Underneath the name Lin Wan, 3 words were written in red. Heartbeat has stopped. But below that, in tiny script, it said, transferred, not deceased. I folded the letter, tucked it into my inner coat pocket, and didn't look back. As I turned, my knee banged against the edge of the trunk with a dull thud. I paused for 2 seconds, then kept walking. Lu Fun was in the surveillance room. He hadn't slept. The lights were off, and the only glow came from the monitors, casting a cold blue light over his face like a funerary mask. He was staring at the screen, watching my every move as I walked from the hallway to the stairs, then into the room at the end of the 2nd floor. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open. I still didn't turn on the light. Lufin stood up. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a gray shirt with the 2nd button loose, a stray thread dangling and swaying before coming to a rest. He walked downstairs silently. When he reached my door, a sliver of light leaked from the gap, not from a lamp, but from my phone screen. He didn't knock. I was sitting on the bed, holding the letter. On the table in front of me sat a glass of water I hadn't touched, a faint yellow ring staining the rim where someone might have taken a sip and put it down. Lufin slapped a file onto the desk. It wasn't loud, but it made a pencil roll across the wood and drop to the floor. You knew all along, didn't you? He asked. I didn't look up. I slowly unfolded the letter and flattened it on the desk, my fingers pressing down on all 4 corners. I stared at it for 3 seconds. Yeah, I said. Lufin stayed still. He stared at the handwriting, his lips moving slightly, but no sound coming out. He looked down at his hands. There was still gray candle ash stuck under his fingernails. He hadn't washed them. He took a step forward, his shoe scuffing against a patch of dried moss on the floor with a soft crunch. When did you find out? When I was 7, I replied. Lufin didn't say anything. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, a light rain was falling, hitting the tin eaves with a steady, patient rhythm. Why didn't you say anything? You didn't ask. You waited for me? Yeah. Lufin turned around. I looked at the webbing between his thumb and index finger on his left hand. There was a faint, old scar there, looking like a burn. I remembered that scar. When we were kids, he always covered it with his right hand, claiming he'd accidentally touched hot water. Did you know from the start that I wasn't his son? He asked. I didn't nod, and I didn't shake my head. I picked up the obstetrics record and pushed it gently toward him. Your father said you wouldn't live past 3 days. Lufin stared at the words. His throat bobbed. He didn't cry, and he didn't curse. He reached out and gathered the letter and the record together, stuffing them into his own pocket. His movements were slow, as if he were afraid of wrinkling the paper. He didn't leave. He stood there, staring at an old coat rack in the corner where one of my jackets hung, the cuffs frayed and a bit of dust clinging to the left shoulder. Why didn't you run away? He asked. If I ran, I said, what would happen to you? Me? Lufin laughed. The sound was as raspy as sandpaper. I don't even know who I am. I didn't answer. I stood up and walked to the door. Your father burned your birth certificate, I said. But he didn't burn your medical records from when you were 7. You had a high fever for 7 straight days. The doctors said you might have brain damage. He didn't tell you that it was because you were injected with sedatives. They wanted you to forget being taken away. Lufin looked down at his shoes. They were caked with mud from the basement. On the inner side of his right foot, there was a tiny scratch, like he'd been snagged by a wire. You always knew, he whispered. You always knew who I was. I knew you weren't his son, I said. But I never knew if you were my brother. Lufin didn't respond to that. He walked to the table and picked up the glass of water. He didn't drink it. He just turned it in his hand. The stain was still there. Your mother isn't dead, he said. My hand froze on the doorknob. She was moved, he continued. Your father said she died, but the nurse remembered. She was sent to a nursing home in the west of the city. 3 years later, she wrote to the director saying she wanted to see her child. The director never replied. Your father intercepted the letter. I closed my eyes and opened them again. My eyelashes didn't even tremble. Why are you telling me now? Because, Lufin said, you've grown up. He set the glass back down. It made a sharp clack against the wood. He walked over to me until there was barely half a step between us. The air smelled of rain and old suitcases. He reached out, but he didn't touch me. Instead, he gently fastened the second button of my coat. The loose thread was still there. He didn't pull it. You're going to the House of Light tomorrow, Lufin said. Yeah. Take that letter. I will. Lufin turned and left without another word. He stopped for a second at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. There was a shallow scratch there, something he'd carved with a pencil when he was a kid. It used to say Lufin was here, but the words were blurred now, leaving only a faint mark. He walked downstairs, his footsteps as silent as a ghost's. I stood there until the door clicked shut. I looked at the glass of water. I walked over, picked it up, and poured it out. The water spiraled down the drain silently. I didn't wash the glass. I went to the window and pulled the curtains. The rain was still falling. A gust of wind blew a piece of paper off the corner of the desk. It was a receipt from yesterday. The wind flipped it over, revealing the print on the back. Asterisk House of Light Children's Shelter. Contact 555-0192. Asterisk. I stared at it for a moment. Outside, a sparrow landed on the tin roof, shook its wings, and flew away. The key to the safe was made of brass, heavy and polished bright from years of being rubbed. I knelt in the basement, my back against the wall, with a stack of papers spread across my knees. They were just standard A4 sheets, the signatures printed neatly. The date was from a winter when I was 7 years old. It was an adoption termination agreement. The signatory, Lufin. I gripped the corner of the paper until my knuckles turned white. I looked down at a black and white photo taped to the bottom right corner. It was yellowed at the edges. It showed a rusted iron cage with dust clinging to the bars. A child was crouching inside, wearing a gray shirt, hair messy, head bowed. A man in a white lab coat stood outside the cage, holding a steaming cup. The man's profile looked like my father, but his eyes weren't in the frame. I flipped the photo over. On the back, written in pencil, were the words, asterisk 2001.12.14. Subject number 7. Identity replacement confirmed, asterisk. I stood up. The basement was dark, the only light bulb broken and swaying on a wire overhead. I walked to the corner where a mirror hung. The wooden frame was cracked, the nails loose, held up by a scrap of frayed rope. I didn't touch the glass. I felt the ash on my fingertips from yesterday's candle. Then, I grabbed a glass ashtray from the table and hurled it. The mirror shattered. The sound wasn't loud, it sounded like ice cracking. Shards sprayed everywhere, some wedging into the door frame, one landing by my feet in the mud. I knelt and picked up a piece. The edge was razor sharp. I let it slide across my palm. The blood spread slowly. One drop, then two, landing right on the papers. The red ink blurred, looking like ink drowning in water. In the photograph, the child's gray collar seemed to freeze. He didn't look up. Blood continued to flow through my fingers, dripping onto the floor in a small, tight puddle that refused to expand. Nearby sat an old shoe, its sole caked with mud. It belonged to Jiangjin. He had left it there yesterday. The door was cracked open. A breeze drifted in from the stairwell, bringing a sharp chill. It caught a loose thread on my second button, making it dance for a moment before falling still. Then, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. They were light and slow. They didn't pause. Jiangjin stood in the doorway. He didn't come inside. Between his fingers, he gripped a copper key. It was old, one of its teeth chipped away. He walked over and pressed the key into my palm. I didn't move. My blood kept dripping, coating the copper and sliding down my hand. This key, Jiangjin said, his voice low. It doesn't open a door. He paused. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the puddle of blood on the floor. Next to the red stain lay a pile of white dust where the wall had peeled away. It looked like the bleached remains of the truth. I looked down at the key. Rust stained the gaps between my fingers, looking exactly like dried blood. I didn't say a word. I just slowly closed my hand, gripping the key tight. The blood smeared across the copper, turning a darker, bruised shade. Jiangjin didn't move, but he didn't leave either. He glanced at the photo on the floor, the child in the gray shirt with his head bowed. When you were 7, Jiangjin said, I heard you crying. I didn't look up. The key dug into my palm, the sharp edges stinging. You cried like a wounded puppy, he continued. My thumb traced the teeth of the key. Once, twice. It was as if I were trying to speak through the metal. Jiangjin stopped talking. He turned to the wall, reached out, and pulled an old photo album from the shelf. The blue cloth cover was faded, the corners curled and worn. He didn't open it. He just stood there, holding it. The wind blew in again, stirring the dust on the floor. The white particles swirled up and settled on my shoes, mixing with the blood. I finally looked up. My eyes weren't red, and they weren't wet. I just stared at him. When did you find out? I asked. On your 7th birthday, Jiangjin replied. You were crying. You said, Brother, I'm so afraid of the dark. I didn't respond. I looked back at my palm. The blood was still flowing, but it had thinned out. The key was completely encased in red, the copper turning dull and dark. You didn't die, Jiangjin said. You were just locked away. I stood up. I didn't bother wiping my hands. Blood dripped from my knuckles, landing on my shoes and splashing near the feet of the child in the photo. I walked to the door and pushed it open. The light in the hallway flickered, humming with a dying energy. Jiangjin didn't follow. He stayed in the dark room, clutching that unopened album. I walked downstairs, my footsteps silent. A clump of mud fell from my shoe onto the 3rd step, leaving a smear. In the living room, I pulled a tin matchbox from a drawer. The metal was old and scratched. When I struck a match, it snagged for a second before catching. I held the flame to the photo. The fire was small and blue, licking at the corners. The paper curled and blackened. For a moment, the reflection of the iron cage flickered on the wall, looking like it had come to life. Then the flame died. Ash fell onto the coffee table in a pile of black flakes. In the center, a tiny scrap of unburnt paper remained. It had 2 words on it, Lu Fun. The black ink looked like a fresh stain. I stood there, staring at the debris. Jiangjin was still at the top of the stairs. He finally opened the album to a single page. The photo showed a child standing alone in a garden. On the back, written in pencil, were the words, December 14th, 2001. Twin Vines. Year 1. Outside, the wind died down. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the ash and a small water stain on the table from where I had washed my hands. Jiangjin quietly closed the album and put it back. He turned and went back upstairs. Once his footsteps faded, the living room went silent, save for the constant, low buzz of the light bulb. I stood in the dark, still clutching the copper key. It was cold and slick with blood. I didn't let go. Outside, a cat leaped over the wall, its shadow darting across the windowsill like a ghost. On the floor, a single speck of ash continued to drift. The spring rain had stopped, but the vines in the backyard were still dripping. Clusters of white flowers hung heavy, looking like frozen tears. Whenever the wind blew, petals drifted down onto the stone steps. Local kids used to huddle under that wall, reaching out but never touching. They were afraid. They said anyone who picked the flowers would hear their name called out in the night, a voice like water leaking from a bucket. I stood on the steps without a coat. The ash from yesterday's fire was still smudged on my cuffs. I looked at my hand. A fresh cut had scabbed over in my palm, the edges angry and red. I walked to the vines and, without a word, plucked a flower. It was tiny and soft, bending the moment I touched it. I walked over to Jiangjin. He was crouching by the steps, his left leg stretched out, his shoes caked in dried, cracking mud. He didn't look up. He was busy digging something out of a crack in the stone, a small, moldy piece of wood. I leaned down and tucked the flower into his shirt. It sat crooked, jammed under his second button. Your mother isn't dead, I said. She just found a different way to live. Jiangjin didn't answer. He placed the wood chip in his palm and blew on it, watching the dust scatter. He looked up at me then. His gaze was hollow, like he was looking at a piece of old wallpaper that was half peeled but still clinging to the wall. I didn't wait for him to speak. I just turned and walked away. The sun set fast. As the clouds parted, the moon cast long shadows of the vines against the wall. They looked like people moving in the dark. Later, Jiangjin lay in bed with the lights off. His phone screen glowed, showing a scan of his mother's letter. He stared at the words heart stopped for 10 minutes before turning it off. In the darkness, the wind whistled through the window, fluttering the curtains. On the corner of the fabric was a faded blue smudge, a sun he had drawn as a child, washed so many times the color was nearly gone. He fell asleep. In his dream, his mother stood under the vines. She wasn't wearing her blue dress or her silver necklace. She was in a white shirt, her hair loose, holding an old copper oil lamp. The glass was cracked. The wick was made of hair, black and gray strands twisted into a tight knot. She smiled at him, but no sound came out. It was a mechanical movement of muscle. Jiang Jin tried to scream, but his throat was tight. He tried to run, but his feet sank into the soil. The vines crawled out of the earth, wrapping around his ankles. They weren't tight, but they held him fast. He bolted upright. A lamp sat on his nightstand. It was the copper lamp from his dream, complete with the cracked glass. The wick was made of 2 locks of hair, one black and one gray, tied in a knot. It glowed with a faint, cold light that gave off no heat. He reached out, his hand hovering over it for 3 seconds. Footsteps sounded outside the door. Light, slow, stopping just outside. A shadow moved under the door frame. Jiang Jin didn't move. He stared at the hair in the lamp. One strand was his. He recognized the slight curl from when he was young. The other was gray, short, and coarse. It was mine. The door opened. I stood there holding a pair of rusted sewing scissors. I was barefoot, my feet covered in backyard mud. A single white petal was stuck between my toes. I cut off half my hair, I said. Jiang Jin didn't look at my face. He looked at the scissors. A smudge of ash from my sleeve had rubbed off onto the handle. Now, I said, we share the same root. Jiang Jin remained silent. He pulled back the covers and stepped onto the cold floor. He walked to the window and drew the curtains. The moon was still high, shining on the vines. Another petal fell. I didn't move. The scissors hung at my side, the rust gleaming dark red in the moonlight. Jiang Jin walked back to the nightstand and picked up the lamp. It wasn't heavy, but the copper felt strangely warm. Not like fire, but like the warmth of a hand that had just been pulled out of a pocket. He walked toward me and held the lamp out. Take it back, he said. I didn't hear him. I was looking down at the mud on my feet. It was already drying, cracking into tiny pieces. A single grain fell onto the floor. Keep it, I told him. Jiang Jin didn't argue. He set the lamp back on the nightstand and went to the wardrobe for a coat. The door didn't close all the way. A length of hemp rope was caught in the gap. The rope was caught in the wardrobe door, a remnant of the suitcase I had dismantled yesterday. Jiang Jin put on his coat, but his fingers were clumsy. He missed a button, sliding the third one into the second hole. I watched him make the mistake, but I didn't say a word. He finished dressing and walked toward the door, his hand gripping the handle. Where are you sleeping tonight? He asked. The basement, I said. Jiang Jin paused. The lamp wick. It was yours when you were a child, wasn't it? Yes. When did you find it? Yesterday, I replied. I didn't sleep. He didn't ask anything else. He pushed the door open and stepped out. The hallway lights were off, except for a single dim bulb at the top of the stairs. Its yellow glow illuminated a spiderweb in the corner, a dead leaf trapped in its silk. He walked downstairs, his steps light and silent. In the dark kitchen, he poured a glass of cold water. He took a sip, his throat feeling dry and rough. He didn't go back to his room. He sat at the dining table, cupping the glass, staring out the window. The shadows of the vines outside crawled across the glass like hands, like feet, like the silhouette of a person crouching in the dark. I didn't go down to join him. In the middle of the night, the wind picked up again, making the vines rustle against the house. The next morning, Jiang Jin found me in the backyard. I was crouching under the vines with a small trowel, digging into the damp, fresh earth. A pile of white flowers I had picked sat untouched beside me. What are you burying? Jiang Jin asked. The flowers, I said. If I bury them, they might grow again next year. I looked at the dirt. Yesterday, you said he was just living in a different way. I did. And now, I didn't look up. I placed the last flower into the pit, covered it with soil, and patted it flat. Now, I said, we have to stay alive. I stood up. My hands were stained with mud, and my sleeves were covered in fresh ash. Jiang Jin watched me, silent. I turned toward the house, but stopped at the door. I didn't look back. Last night, I asked, "Did you dream of him?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Jiang Jin didn't answer. He looked down at his shoes. A bit of fresh mud had stuck to his soles. I walked inside. The large lamp was still on the nightstand. The knot in the wick flickered slightly, as if someone had breathed on it. A breeze drifted from the backyard, through the hallway, and under the door. The flame didn't go out. The flowers outside were still in bloom. 3 white petals fell onto the stone steps. An ant crawled over one, paused for 2 seconds, and moved on. Later, we met with the UN Children's Fund officials. They sat in the meeting room near the door, their knuckles white as they gripped uncapped pens. They didn't speak. They just stared at the projection screen. I stood at the front without my coat. The ash from yesterday's candles was still smeared on my cuffs. The technician inserted a tape. There was a click, like a door locking. The recording began. It was my father's voice, distorted and faint, like a letter soaked in water. He was mumbling a name, coughing as if his throat were full of sand. At the 7-minute and 48-second mark, the sound cut out. The technician frowned, paused the tape, and rewound it. It was still blank. "The last 3 minutes were erased," he said quietly. Everyone heard him. I didn't move. I stood by the projector, near Jiang Jin's shoes. The mud on his soles had dried and cracked like ancient pottery. The technician tried 3 more times, finally using software to repair the audio. When the sound returned, the air conditioner seemed to stop breathing. "Jiang Jin must die," my father's voice rang out. "Otherwise, the Liu family will be destroyed by his hands." A 2-second pause followed. Then, another voice joined in. It was raspy, sounding like it crawled out from underground. "That child. He remembers when he was 7. You locked him in the basement yourself, right?" My breath hitched. I didn't turn my head, but my pupils constricted. That voice wasn't my father's. It was mine. I remembered being 7. I remembered being locked in a basement. I remembered the sound of the iron door slamming shut, the smell of mold, and the way I clawed at the floor until my fingernails bled and tore off. I remembered someone crying in the dark. It sounded like water leaking from a bucket. But I had never been to that basement. I had never seen that place. When I was 7, I was supposed to be in a Swiss orphanage. My father told me I had been kidnapped, that the ransom failed, and that I nearly died in the snow. I turned to look at Jiang Jin. He was sitting in the 3rd row, his left hand on his knee, his right hand open as if catching rain. He wasn't looking at me or the screen. He was staring at a scar on his ring finger, a mark left by a chain a long time ago. It was faded, but the outline was clear. "The audio is layered," the technician whispered. "It's a stitch-up of 2 different recordings. The original data was tampered with." No one replied. I stood there for 5 seconds, then walked out without a word. The hallway lights flickered. I went to the water cooler and filled a cup. The water was cold. I didn't drink it. I just held it, watching the ripples. There was a faint tooth mark on the rim of the cup. I didn't know who it belonged to. Jiang Jin followed me out. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out an old cassette tape. The plastic casing was worn white at the edges. The label was handwritten in a shaky, childlike scrawl, Liu Fun's 7th birthday. November 3rd, 1999. I didn't take it. He set the tape on the stainless steel counter of the water cooler. Droplets leaked from the machine, landing on the tape one by one, staining the label. "You cried all night that day," Jiang Jin said. "You said, 'Brother, I'm scared of the dark.'" My hand trembled, shaking the water in my cup. My eyes began to sting. "You weren't kidnapped," Jiang Jin continued. "You were the one the family gave up. Father locked you in the basement and gave me your identity. He thought if you died, I could live as you." I traced the tooth mark on the cup with my thumb. Over and over. "Do you remember?" Jiang Jin asked. "When you cried, I crouched outside the door. I was holding your favorite glass marble. You always said it could reflect the moon." My throat tightened, but I couldn't speak. "Do you remember the basement wall?" he said. "The 3rd brick on the left was loose. You scratched at it until you made a gap. You stuffed half a biscuit inside. You said it was for Mom." I set the cup down, leaving it a third full. I turned away from him and walked toward the stairs. Jiang Jin didn't follow. He stood there watching the water drip onto the tape, blurring the date. November 3rd, 1999. I went to the basement door. It wasn't locked. I pushed it open and walked down into the darkness. The concrete stairs groaned under my weight. At the bottom, the broken mirror was still there, shards of glass scattered across the floor. One piece was stuck in the doorframe. Another lay by my feet, covered in mud. I knelt and picked up a shard. The sharp edge sliced into my palm. One drop of blood hit the floor, then two. I didn't wipe it away. I looked at the wall. The third brick on the left. I reached out and clawed at it. The brick wobbled. I pulled harder, my fingernails splitting, blood mixing with the dust. Finally, the brick gave way and thudded onto the floor. Behind it was a small, rusted iron box. I opened it. Inside was a yellowed, black and white photograph. It showed a rusted iron cage. A child in a dirty gray shirt sat inside, head bowed. Outside the window stood a man in a white lab coat, holding a syringe. The profile of his face looked exactly like my father. On the back of the photo, someone had written in pencil, December 14th, 2001. Subject number 7. Identity replacement confirmed, *. I stared at the photo for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I put the photo back in the box, shoved the whole thing into my pocket, and stood up. I walked to the corner of the basement and touched the frayed end of the hemp rope still hanging there. It swayed gently in the draft coming from the stairs. I turned and slowly walked back up. Jiang Jin was still in the same spot, standing by the water dispenser. He was clutching that water-damaged cassette tape in his hand. He didn't move. He didn't even look at me. I stopped right in front of him. "You knew all along," I said. Jiang Jin didn't nod, but he didn't shake his head either. He just looked down at the water stains on the tape, tracing them like rivers on a map. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. He placed the tape gently on top of the water dispenser. The machine was still leaking, one drop at a time. Drip. Drip. If I told you, he asked quietly, would you have believed me? I didn't answer. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the photo I'd just found, and set it down next to the tape. On the photograph, the collar of the boy's gray shirt seemed to twitch. It wasn't the wind. The boy in the photo actually lifted his head. I didn't back away. I stared at that face. It was my face. Jiang Jin finally looked up at me. His gaze reminded me of old, peeling wallpaper, half detached, yet still clinging on. The hallway light flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, there was only the sound of the water. Drip. 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 I turned and headed for the stairs. Jiang Jin didn't follow. He stayed there, staring at those two objects, the photo and the tape, drowning in the water stains. A breeze crept through the window cracks, fluttering the curtains. On the corner of the fabric was a faded blue patch, a sun he had drawn as a child. It had been washed so many times the color was almost gone. He didn't move until my footsteps vanished. Only then did he bend down, pick up the tape, and slip it into his pocket. He turned off the water dispenser, and the dripping finally stopped. The basement door remained open, venting a smell of mold and rust into the air. Names have weight. The hall of the lighthouse had no windows. The ceiling was an old church vault, the paint peeling away to reveal gray plaster like layers of cast-off skin. We stood in 2 rows, each of us clutching a slip of paper. These were our numbers from when we were trafficked, red ink on scrap paper, a letter following each digit like a brand on livestock. A staff member in a gray suit stood at the front. His tie was crooked and untied, just draped around his neck. He didn't speak. He just nodded. A girl walked forward, tore her paper into 4 pieces, and threw them into a metal bucket. The flames licked the paper. There was no sound, just a wisp of blue smoke. Next was a 6-year-old boy. His hair was cropped short, revealing a scar behind his ear. He stood frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped his paper. "What is your name?" the staff member asked. The boy opened his mouth. "I." The hall fell silent. Someone coughed. Someone shifted their weight, their shoes scraping dryly against the floor. No one laughed. No one rushed him. We all knew that name wasn't on any official register. Jiang Jin stood in the back row. He wasn't wearing a coat, and his shirt cuffs were still stained with gray ash from yesterday's candles. He hadn't cleaned them. He didn't move forward or back. He just watched the boy. The boy didn't cry. He didn't look down. He stared at the floor as if looking at dust in a mouse hole. Jiang Jin walked over, his steps light. The mud on his shoes had dried and cracked into flakes. He knelt down to eye level with the boy. "Do you remember what your mother looked like?" The boy shook his head. Then, he pulled a photo from his pocket. It was old, the edges curled and yellowed as if it had been soaked and dried again. It showed a woman holding an infant under a porch. The wooden pillars were peeling, revealing the pale grain underneath. In the background, there was a carved iron gate with a lion head knocker missing its left eye. Jiang Jin froze. His breathing slowed as he stared at the image. The boy handed it to him. Jiang Jin took it, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the back. Some people began to crowd around, moving quickly. A bit of ash fell from Jiang Jin's cuff onto the floor. He didn't look at Jiang Jin or the boy. He only had eyes for that photo. He reached out and snatched it. A thin layer of paper was glued to the back, now brittle with age. He picked at it with his fingernail. Once, twice, 3 times. The paper tore, revealing small, faint words written in pencil. Lu Fun, November 3rd, 1992. Real name. The hall lights hummed and flickered, but stayed on. My hands shook so violently, I almost dropped the photo. I didn't look away from those words. They looked like an old scar. Jiang Jin stood up. He didn't say a word. He looked down at his shoes, watching a piece of dried mud fall off his left foot. The boy looked up at me. "Do you know him?" "Lu Fun," I whispered. I flipped the photo back over. The woman's eyes were closed, her lips turned up in a slight smile, as if she were laughing or perhaps enduring something. I remembered this face. When I was 7, in a Swiss orphanage, a nurse had shown me a photo and said, "This is your mother." In that photo, she wore a blue dress and a silver chain, standing under a vine. But that vine had been withered. This photo was different. The background was the porch of the old Lu family estate. I had never been there. When I was 7, I wasn't even in China. My throat tightened. I couldn't make a sound. "You aren't a replacement," Jiang Jin said, his voice so soft it was like he was afraid of breaking the silence. "You were the one who was stolen." Someone in the hall gasped. Others looked at their shoes or reached into their pockets to make sure they still had their own numbered slips. The boy didn't cry or smile. He reached out, took the photo back from my hand, folded it carefully, and put it away. He turned and walked back to the line. I stayed where I was, paralyzed. Jiang Jin walked to my side. He didn't look at my face. He just stared at the small pile of gray ash on the floor that had fallen from my sleeve. "On your 7th birthday," Jiang Jin said, "I made a promise." I didn't respond. "You were crying," he continued. "You said, 'Brother, I'm so scared of the dark.'" My right hand moved unconsciously to my wrist. There was a scar there, old, faint, the kind left by a rope. I wasn't wearing long sleeves, so the white mark was visible. "You were locked in the basement," Jiang Jin said. "It wasn't me. It was my father. He locked you in there for 3 days because he said you were too noisy. You cried, so he stuffed a rag in your mouth. You bit your lip until it bled. He wiped the blood off the floor. He wiped it 7 times. My breath hitched. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at the boy. I stared at the door at the end of the hall. It was cracked open, leading to a pitch-black corridor. "Do you remember the sound of the iron door closing?" Jiang Jin asked. I didn't answer. I looked down and saw the ash from my sleeve mixed with the dirt on the floor. I knelt down and rubbed it with my finger. The gray soot got under my fingernail. I didn't wipe it off. Jiang Jin stopped talking. In the hall, another child stepped forward, tore their number, and threw it into the bucket. The flames flared up again, sending more blue smoke into the air. A staff member walked over with a stack of papers. "Next item. The renaming ceremony is over. Parents, please sign to confirm." No one moved. Jiang Jin took a pen from his pocket and handed it over. The staff member took it, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the pen. I stood up, turned around, and walked out. I didn't look back. Jiang Jin followed me. The hallway lights were motion-activated. They flickered on as we passed, illuminating old posters on the walls. "Child safety starts with a name." The ink was fading, the corners curling like they'd been underwater. We reached the stairwell. I stopped. I didn't go up, and I didn't go down. I pulled a stub of a candle from my pocket. It was short, with a pool of dried wax at the bottom like a frozen tear. I clicked a lighter. The flame was tiny, flickering in the draft. Jiang Jin watched me. I didn't say anything. I just placed the candle on the windowsill of the landing. The sill was thick with dust and marked with 3 scratches, half-finished tally marks from a child who lived here long ago. The flame wavered as the wind whistled through the gaps in the glass. Jiang Jin reached out as if to steady the candle, but he stopped himself. I looked at the small light and finally spoke. I used to light candles here when I was a kid. Jiang Jin didn't ask why. I just stood there, staring at the small flame, and felt the words slip out of me. That night, I heard someone crying. I paused, the memory hitting me like a physical weight. I thought it was me. The candle burned down half an inch. A drop of hot wax slid down the side, landing in the dust on the windowsill. It didn't melt into the grime. It just hardened into a small, ugly lump. Jiang Jin checked his watch. It was 10:17. He turned to walk back, but I didn't move. I stayed there, watching the candle, watching the flame, watching the gray ash. A draft swept through the hallway, and the candle flickered out. Everything went black. The motion lights in the corridor died at the same time. Downstairs, someone shouted my name. Lu Fun, come down and eat. I didn't answer. I left the short stub of the candle in the pool of hardened wax on the landing. The wind caught the dust on the sill, swirling it into the air before it drifted out the window. Outside, the moon finally broke through the clouds. Its light hit the iron gate of the House of Light. The lion head on the door knocker was missing its left eye, but the right one seemed to glow in the dark. Inside the room, a sliver of light leaked through the door crack. The paper shredder hummed in the corner like a broken refrigerator. I stood in front of it, clutching a DV tape. My fingernails dug into the plastic casing, leaving white marks. Jiang Jin was by the door, his left hand shoved in his trench coat pocket, his right resting on the frame. His knuckles pressed against a crack in the wood. The room was dark, save for the rhythmic red flash of the shredder's status light. It cast my shadow against the wall, making it look like a flag flapping in the wind. I didn't say a word. I fed the tape into the machine. Click. The plastic cracked. The gears groaned as they caught the magnetic strip, pulling it in like strands of hair. I didn't try to stop it. I just watched it get mangled into a gray-black mess of tangled wire. At the 7-second mark, I hit pause. The screen flickered to life. It was a shot of my father kneeling in front of me. His hair was completely white. His forehead was pressed against the cold concrete wall of the basement. Tears had carved 2 muddy tracks through the grime on his face. His lips were moving, but there was no sound. I could read his mouth, though. I'm sorry. I'm afraid you'll end up like him. I stared at the 7-year-old version of myself on the screen. That boy wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking or begging for help. He was just watching his father with a terrifying stillness. There was no hate in those eyes, and no fear. He looked like he was watching someone who had lost their way, someone he knew could never go back, but he was waiting for them to stop anyway. I didn't look away. Jiang Jin walked up behind me. His footsteps were light. The mud on his shoes had dried and cracked into flakes. He placed a glass of water on the desk. It was only a third full, with tiny white specks of an undissolved pill floating on the surface. When did you find out? I asked. I still didn't turn around. Your 7th birthday, Jiang Jin said. You recorded it that day. I did. Did you hear it? You never told me. If I had, Jiang Jin asked, would you have believed me? I didn't have an answer for that. I kept my eyes on the screen. My father's hand was still on my shoulder, his fingers trembling, dirt under his nails like he'd just been digging in the earth. The shredder was still spinning, but the tape was gone. Only a few thin threads remained caught in the blades, swaying in the breeze. Jiang Jin walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just a bit. It was almost dark outside. The streetlights hadn't turned on yet. Down by the trash cans, a stray cat sat perfectly still, its tail curled around its paws, staring at the lid. You aren't a replacement, Jiang Jin said. I didn't move. You're my brother, he added. Finally, I turned my head. I looked at him with that same calm, empty expression. My eyes felt like they had just been washed and hadn't dried yet. Do you remember what your mother looked like? I asked. Jiang Jin froze. You asked that child, he muttered. Do you remember? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. The corners were curled and yellowed, looking like it had been soaked in water and dried out a dozen times. It showed a woman holding a baby under a wooden porch. The paint on the pillars was peeling, revealing the pale grain underneath. In the background was an ornate iron gate with a lion head knocker. It was missing its left eye. He set the photo on the desk next to the water glass. I reached out and touched it. You kept this all along? I asked. Yeah. Why? Because you said you remembered that door. My throat tightened. I looked down at my sleeve and saw a smudge of ash from the candle I'd burned yesterday. It was pale, like a frozen footprint. I flipped the photo over. On the back, there was a line of small, faint pencil marks, written as if the person was afraid of being seen. Lu Fun, November 3rd, 1992. Real name. I stared at that name for a long time. The shredder finally cut off. The red light died. The room went completely dark until the streetlights outside flickered on. The yellow glow crawled across the floor, inching over Jiang Jin's shoes and reaching my feet. I bent down and picked up a single strand of tape caught in the machine. It was still warm. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't hide it either. I just held it. Jiang Jin walked over to me. He took off his trench coat and draped it over the back of a chair. A seam on the inside of the collar had come undone, the thread hanging down like a broken rope. The lawyer said the will be announced tomorrow, Jiang Jin said. I know. What do you plan to do? I didn't answer. I walked to the corner of the room where an old tin box sat. It wasn't locked, just held shut by a single rubber band. I opened it. Inside were a few old cassette tapes, a discharge slip from a children's hospital, and a brass key covered in dried mud. I took the key out and placed it on the desk next to the photo. This key, I said. It belonged to Lin Wan. Jiang Jin didn't move. When did you get that? The day you left for Switzerland. You didn't ask me. And you didn't tell me. I pushed the key across the desk toward him. Keep it. Jiang Jin didn't take it. He turned and walked to the door. When he pulled the handle, the hinges groaned like the bones of an old house. Tomorrow, he said, I'm going with you. I watched his back. I didn't nod, and I didn't shake my head. Outside, the wind picked up, making the leaves of the old locust tree rustle. A sparrow landed on the windowsill, tilting its head to look inside. It didn't fly away. It just pecked at the dust on the frame. I walked over and cut the power to the shredder. Total silence. I turned back and saw Jiang Jin still standing in the doorway. He hadn't opened it yet, and he wasn't looking back. Do you hate me? I asked. Jiang Jin didn't answer. He just raised his hand and blocked the sliver of light coming through the door crack with his palm. The room got darker, but he didn't close the door. I walked over and stood beside him. We stood there in the shadows, side by side. Downstairs, the cat finally moved. It leaped onto the trash can and vanished into the depths of the alley. The wind kept blowing, and slowly, the light began to leak through the door again, as if nothing had happened at all. The lawyer finished reading the last line of the will. The meeting room was as silent as a dead refrigerator. No one clapped. No one cried. There was only the faint hum of the air conditioner overhead. I sat in the third row on the left. I was wearing the suit Jiang Jin had bought me. The sleeve still had that smudge of ash on it. I hadn't washed it. I didn't look at anyone. My eyes were fixed on a shallow scratch on the table that ran from the top left corner to the bottom right. It looked like it had been made by a fingernail or maybe a key. Jiang Jin sat across from me. His left hand was resting on his briefcase. The corners were worn white, and the zipper was missing a piece, revealing a bit of blue thread. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The lawyer cleared his throat. The reading of the will is complete, he said. As for the inheritance,